Hello, friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Denton Lyle had been driving trucks for nearly 15 years, and in all that time, he thought he'd seen everything the road had to offer. He'd driven through blizzards that turned the world into a wall of white static, pushed through dust storms in West Texas where the sun turned blood red at noon, and once he'd even watched a funnel cloud touch down maybe 3 miles to his right, while he white-knuckled the steering wheel and prayed his rig wouldn't flip. But nothing, absolutely nothing in his decade and a half on the road had prepared him for what he was about to experience on a lonely stretch of Highway 686 in the New Mexico desert. People called him Denny. It was shorter, friendlier, easier to say over the CB radio when you were trying to warn someone about a smoky up ahead, or just shooting the breeze to stay awake on a long haul. Denny was 42 years old, divorced, with a daughter he saw twice a month when his routes brought him back through Albuquerque. He wasn't a big guy, maybe 5'9" and 170 pounds, but he had the kind of weathered, sun-damaged face that made him look older than he was. His hands were calloused from years of wrestling with steering wheels and tie-down straps, and he had a habit of chewing on toothpicks to keep himself from buying another pack of cigarettes. He'd quit smoking 3 years ago, but the urge still hit him hard on nights like this, when the road stretched out empty and endless and the silence in the cab felt thick enough to choke on. It was late October, and Denny was hauling a load of construction equipment from Gallup to Farmington. The route took him up through the northwestern corner of New Mexico, through the kind of country that looked like the surface of Mars, all red rock and scrub brush and nothing else for miles in every direction. During the day, it was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving kind of way, but at night it became something else entirely. At night, the desert transformed into a vast, black emptiness that seemed to swallow up everything, even sound. Denny had driven this route dozens of times before, and he knew every curve, every grade, every place where the road dipped down into an arroyo and then climbed back up the other side. He could practically drive it in his sleep, which was good, because it was just past 2 in the morning and he was fighting to keep his eyes open. The highway was completely deserted. Denny hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour, not even another truck. That wasn't unusual for this time of night on this particular stretch of road, but it always made him a little uneasy. There was something about being the only living soul for miles around that got under his skin, made him think too much about what would happen if something went wrong out here. If his truck broke down, if he had a medical emergency, if anything happened, he'd be on his own until someone else happened to pass by, and that could be hours. He'd heard stories about truckers who died out here in the desert, heart attacks mostly, and weren't found until the next day when another driver spotted their rig on the shoulder and called it in. Denny shook his head, trying to clear away the morbid thoughts. He was fine. The truck was running smooth, the engine humming along like a purr, and he had maybe another hour before he'd hit Farmington and find a place to park for the night. He reached over and turned up the radio, hoping some music would help keep him alert, but all he got was static. That was another thing about this stretch of highway. Radio reception was terrible. Too far from any major cities, too many mountains in the way. He flipped through the channels, searching for anything, even a scratchy AM station playing Spanish-language talk radio, but there was nothing. Just that endless hiss of white noise. With a sigh, Denny gave up on the radio and switched over to his CB instead. At least with the CB, he might be able to catch some chatter from other truckers, even if they were miles away. The CB could reach pretty far out here in the flat desert, especially at night when the atmosphere did weird things with radio signals. He picked up the mic and keyed it, his voice coming out rough from too much coffee and not enough sleep. "Breaker 19, this is Denny heading north on 66. Anybody out there got their ears on?" He waited, listening to the static, hoping for a response. Sometimes other drivers would answer just to break up the monotony of the drive, swap stories or warnings about road conditions up ahead. But tonight there was nothing, just more static, punctuated by the occasional pop or crackle that might have been atmospheric interference or might have been something else entirely. Denny set the mic back in its cradle and settled in for another hour of silence. The road ahead was perfectly straight, the white lines glowing in his headlights like twin tracks leading off into infinity. On either side of the highway, the desert was pitch black, the kind of darkness you only got when you were far from any town, any house, any source of light at all. Denny could see stars overhead, thousands of them, so bright and clear they looked like someone had punched holes in the sky. He'd always liked looking at the stars when he was out here, liked feeling small and insignificant in a way that was somehow comforting. Whatever problems he had, whatever mistakes he'd made, they didn't matter much when you looked at it from that perspective. That's when he saw the truck. It was parked on the shoulder about a quarter-mile ahead, no lights on, just a dark shape against the darker desert. As Denny got closer, his headlights picked it out in more detail. A big rig, probably a Kenworth or a Peterbilt, with a standard trailer attached. The truck was facing the same direction Denny was traveling, like the driver had pulled over and just stopped. There were no hazard lights flashing, no flares set out, nothing to indicate the driver was having mechanical trouble or needed assistance. The truck was just sitting there, silent and still, like it had been abandoned. Denny's first instinct was to keep driving. It was late, he was tired, and for all he knew the driver was just taking a break, catching some sleep before continuing on. But something about the scene didn't sit right with him. A professional driver didn't just park on the shoulder without putting out some kind of warning, especially not out here where the next vehicle might not come along for an hour or more. And why would anyone choose to park here in the middle of nowhere, when Farmington was less than an hour up the road and there were proper truck stops with lights and security and other people around? Against his better judgment, Denny eased off the accelerator and started to slow down. He told himself he'd just do a quick check, make sure everything was okay, maybe knock on the cab door and see if the driver needed help. It was the right thing to do, the trucker code, looking out for each other when you were out here on the road alone. He pulled his rig onto the shoulder about 50 feet behind the parked truck, put on his hazard lights, and set the air brake. The sudden silence when he shut off the engine was startling. Out here, away from the highway noise, the quiet was absolute, almost physical in its intensity. Denny grabbed his flashlight from the door pocket and climbed down from the cab. The desert air was cold, much colder than he'd expected, and he wished he'd thought to grab his jacket. He could see his breath in the beam of the flashlight as he walked toward the parked truck, his boots crunching on the gravel shoulder. As he got closer, he could see that the truck was old, maybe 20 years or more, with faded paint and rust spots on the trailer. The license plate was so covered in dust he couldn't read it. "Hello?" Denny called out, his voice sounding small and strange in the vast emptiness. "Anybody there? You need some help?" There was no answer. Denny walked up to the driver's side door and shone his flashlight through the window. The cab was empty. No driver, no sleeping bag, no personal belongings that he could see. The seats looked like they hadn't been sat in for a long time, and there was a layer of dust on the dashboard that suggested the truck had been sitting here for days, maybe weeks. That didn't make any sense. How could a truck just be abandoned out here like this? Where had the driver gone? Denny walked around to the back of the trailer, playing his flashlight beam over the doors. They were closed and locked, and when he gave them a tug, they didn't budge. Whatever was inside, if anything, was sealed up tight. He walked back around to the driver's side, more confused than ever. This whole situation was wrong. Even if the driver had abandoned the truck for some reason, even if he'd gotten a ride with another trucker or called someone to pick him up, there should have been some indication of what had happened. But there was nothing. Just this ghost truck sitting on the side of the highway, like it had materialized out of thin air. That's when he heard it. A voice crackling and distorted, coming from inside the truck's cab. It took Denny a moment to realize what he was hearing. It was the CB radio, and someone was talking on it. "Denny, Denny Lyle." Denny froze, his hand on the truck's door handle. The voice had said his name. Someone on the CB radio had just said his name. That was impossible. The truck was empty, abandoned. There was no one inside to key the mic. And even if there had been, how would they know his name? He hadn't given his full name over the radio, just his handle, just Denny. The voice came again, clearer this time, and Denny felt ice water run down his spine. "Denny Lyle, we've been waiting for you." Denny took a step back from the truck, his heart hammering in his chest. This wasn't right. None of this was right. He turned and started walking quickly back toward his own rig, the flashlight beam bobbing and weaving as he moved. Behind him, the voice continued, growing louder, more insistent, even though he was getting farther away from the abandoned truck. "Don't leave, Denny. We need to talk. We have so much to tell you." Denny broke into a run. He didn't care how it looked, didn't care if he was overreacting to something that had a perfectly rational explanation. Every instinct he had was screaming at him to get back to his truck, to get the hell away from this place, to put as many miles as possible between himself and that voice on the radio. He reached his cab, hauled himself up into the driver's seat, and slammed the door behind him. His hands were shaking as he turned the key, and for one terrible moment he thought the engine wasn't going to start, but then it caught and roared to life. Denny threw the truck into gear and pulled back onto the highway, his tires kicking up gravel as he accelerated away from the abandoned truck. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, refusing to look in his mirrors, refusing to see if the abandoned truck was still sitting there on the shoulder, or if it had somehow disappeared the same way it had appeared. His CB radio crackled, and Denny reached over to turn it off, but before his hand could reach the knob, that voice came through again, crystal clear now, as if the person speaking was sitting right there in the cab with him. "You can't run from us, Denny. We're already here. We've always been here, and we know exactly where you're going." Denny's hand hovered over the CB, frozen in place. The voice was different now. Multiple voices speaking in unison, layered over each other in a way that made his head hurt. They weren't speaking English anymore, at least not any English he could understand. The words were wrong, twisted, like someone had taken a recording of human speech and played it backwards, then forwards again at the wrong speed. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the voice stopped. The CB went silent, not even static, just dead air. Denny sat there in the driver's seat, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. He told himself it had been some kind of prank, some bored trucker with too much time on his hands playing games on the radio. But he didn't believe it. He'd heard the voice say his full name, his real name, not just his CB handle. And he'd seen that abandoned truck, sitting there in the middle of nowhere with no explanation for how it had gotten there or where the driver had gone. Denny drove for another 20 minutes before he started to calm down. His heart rate slowed, his breathing evened out, and he began to feel foolish for panicking the way he had. He'd been on the road too long, was too tired, and his mind had played tricks on him. That had to be it. The truck had probably belonged to another driver who'd had mechanical trouble and hitched a ride with someone else. The voice on the CB had been some kind of weird radio interference, or maybe another trucker who'd looked up his name from his company's logo on the side of his trailer. There was a rational explanation for everything. There had to be. But deep down, in a place he didn't want to acknowledge, Denny knew that wasn't true. Something had happened back there on the highway, something that didn't fit into the neat categories of mechanical failures and radio glitches, something that existed in the spaces between rational explanations, in the dark corners where logic couldn't reach. Denny was about 10 miles from Farmington when he saw the lights in his rearview mirror. At first, he thought it was another truck coming up behind him, but as the lights got closer, he realized they were wrong. They were too high off the ground, too bright, and they were moving faster than any truck should be able to move. Within seconds, the vehicle was right behind him, close enough that Denny could feel his trailer shudder from the air displacement. He glanced in his side mirror and felt his stomach drop. It was the abandoned truck, the same old Kenworth with the faded paint and rusted trailer, but now it was moving, barreling down the highway at speeds that should have been impossible for a rig that size. The cab was dark, no lights on inside, and Denny couldn't see anyone behind the wheel. It was as if the truck was driving itself, chasing him down the empty highway in the dead of night. Denny pressed down on the accelerator, pushing his own truck as fast as it would go. But the abandoned truck matched his speed effortlessly. It stayed right on his bumper, so close that if Denny hit his brakes, they would have collided. The CB crackled to life again, and this time Denny didn't hesitate. He grabbed the mic and keyed it, his voice coming out high and tight with fear. "Who are you? What do you want?" The response was immediate. That same chorus of voices speaking in unison. "We want you to remember, Denny. We want you to remember what you did. We want you to remember why you're out here driving this road, running from something you can't name." Denny's mind raced. What were they talking about? He hadn't done anything, hadn't hurt anyone, hadn't committed any crime that would explain this nightmare chase. He was just a trucker, just a guy trying to make a living and see his daughter twice a month. There was nothing in his past that would warrant this. Nothing that would explain why he was being hunted by a phantom truck on a deserted highway. "I don't know what you're talking about," Denny shouted into the mic. "I haven't done anything. Leave me alone." The voices laughed, a sound like breaking glass and grinding metal. "You don't remember. Not yet. But you will, Denny. When you reach the place where it happened, you'll remember everything. And then you'll understand why we're here. Why we've always been here, waiting for you to come back." The truck behind him surged forward, and for a moment Denny thought it was going to ram him, but instead it pulled alongside, matching his speed perfectly. Denny looked over at the driver's side window of the other truck, and what he saw made him nearly lose control of his rig. There was something in the driver's seat, a shape that might have been human, but wasn't. Couldn't be. It was too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at wrong angles and a head that tilted to the side in a way that suggested the neck was broken. The thing turned to look at Denny, and in the darkness of the cab he could see eyes that glowed with a pale, sickly light. Denny screamed. He couldn't help it. The sound tore out of his throat, raw and primal. The sound of a man confronted with something that shouldn't exist. He jerked the steering wheel to the right, trying to put distance between himself and the nightmare truck, but the other rig matched his movement, staying right alongside him. The thing in the driver's seat raised one impossibly long arm and pressed its hand, if you could call it a hand, against the window. Denny could see long, spidery fingers spreading out across the glass, and for one horrible moment, he thought the thing was going to break through, was going to reach across the space between the two trucks and drag him out of his cab. And then suddenly the other truck was gone, just vanished, as if it had never been there at all. Denny was alone on the highway again, the road ahead empty and dark. No sign of the abandoned truck or the thing that had been driving it. The CB was silent. The desert was still. It was as if the last 10 minutes had been a hallucination, a waking nightmare brought on by exhaustion and too many hours behind the wheel. But Denny knew better. His hands were still shaking, his shirt was soaked with sweat, and he could still hear the echo of those voices in his head, telling him to remember, telling him he would understand when he reached the place where it happened. He didn't know what that meant, didn't know what place they were talking about, but he knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't over. Whatever had started back there on the highway, it was just beginning. Denny drove the rest of the way to Farmington in a state of numb shock. He found a truck stop on the edge of town, pulled into a parking space, and sat in his cab with the engine running and all the doors locked. He didn't sleep, he couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that thing in the other truck, that impossibly tall figure with its glowing eyes and broken neck. He saw the abandoned truck sitting on the shoulder, and he heard those voices on the CB radio, speaking his name, telling him they'd been waiting. When the sun finally came up, painting the desert in shades of orange and gold, Denny felt some of the tension drain out of his body. Morning made everything seem less threatening, less real. He could almost convince himself that it had been a dream, some kind of stress-induced hallucination. Almost, but not quite. Because he'd seen what he'd seen, and he'd heard what he'd heard, and no amount of daylight was going to change that. Denny climbed down from his cab and walked into the truck stop diner. He needed coffee, needed food, needed to be around other people, and convince himself that the world was still normal, still operating according to the rules he understood. The diner was busy with the morning rush, truckers grabbing breakfast before heading out on their routes, and the noise and bustle was comforting in a way Denny couldn't quite articulate. He slid into a booth and ordered coffee and eggs from a tired-looking waitress. While he waited for his food, he pulled out his phone and did something he'd been putting off for hours. He Googled Highway 666. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Maybe some history about the road. Maybe reports from other drivers who'd experienced something similar. What he found made his blood run cold. Highway 666 had a reputation. Truckers called it the Devil's Highway, and there were dozens of stories about strange occurrences on that stretch of road. Abandoned vehicles that appeared and disappeared. Voices on the CB radio that knew things they shouldn't, that spoke in languages no one recognized. Phantom trucks that chased drivers down the empty highway, always appearing at night, always vanishing without a trace. And accidents, so many accidents, crashes that happened for no apparent reason. Drivers who ran off the road or into other vehicles, claiming in their final moments that something had been chasing them, something that wasn't human. Denny set his phone down, his hands trembling. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't the first person to experience this, and he wouldn't be the last. But knowing that didn't make him feel any better. If anything, it made things worse, because it meant that what he'd encountered out there on the highway was real, was a recurring phenomenon that had been happening for years, maybe decades, and no one had been able to stop it. No one had been able to explain it. The waitress brought his food, but Denny found he'd lost his appetite. He sipped his coffee and stared out the window at the parking lot, watching other truckers come and go, wondering if any of them had driven Highway 666, if any of them had heard the voices or seen the phantom truck. He wanted to ask, wanted to find someone who would understand what he'd been through. But he knew how crazy he would sound. His phone buzzed, and Denny looked down to see a text from his dispatcher. Another load was ready for pickup in Gallup, heading back down to Albuquerque. The route would take him back on Highway 666, back through that stretch of desert where the abandoned truck had been sitting, back to the place where the voices had spoken his name. Denny's first instinct was to refuse, to tell his dispatcher he was sick, that his truck needed maintenance, anything to avoid going back on that road, but he knew he couldn't do that. If he started refusing loads, started avoiding certain routes, he'd lose his job. And more than that, he'd be admitting that whatever had happened to him out there had broken him, had taken away his ability to do the one thing he knew how to do. So, Denny finished his coffee, paid his bill, and walked back out to his truck. He climbed up into the cab, started the engine, and pulled out of the truck stop parking lot. He would drive Highway 666 again. He would go back through that stretch of desert. And if the voices came back, if the phantom truck appeared in his mirrors, he would face it. He didn't have a choice. But as Denny merged onto the highway and pointed his truck south, back toward that lonely stretch of road through the New Mexico desert, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was driving toward something. Some inevitable confrontation that had been waiting for him all along. The voices had told him he would remember when he reached the place where it happened, and Denny was terrified that they were right, that somewhere in his past there was something he'd forgotten, something he'd buried deep in his memory where it couldn't hurt him, something that was about to come back. Denny drove south for 3 hours before he had to stop again. His hands were cramping from gripping the steering wheel too hard, and his eyes felt like they were full of sand from staring at the road without blinking. He'd been checking his mirrors obsessively, watching for any sign of that phantom truck, any flicker of headlights that didn't belong, but the highway had remained mercifully empty. Just him and the desert and the sun climbing higher in the morning sky, burning away the shadows that had terrified him during the night. He pulled into a small truck stop just outside of Gallup, a place called the Desert Rose that catered mostly to local traffic. It wasn't much, just a gas station with a few diesel pumps and a convenience store that sold overpriced snacks and energy drinks. But it was busy enough that Denny felt safe there. He parked his rig away from the main building, killed the engine, and sat for a moment in the silence trying to gather his thoughts. His phone showed it was just past 9 in the morning. In a normal world, on a normal day, he would have been exhausted from driving through the night and ready to catch a few hours of sleep before picking up his next load. But this wasn't a normal day, and Denny knew that if he closed his eyes now, he'd see that thing in the driver's seat of the phantom truck. Those glowing eyes and that broken neck and those impossibly long fingers pressing against the glass. So instead of sleeping, Denny climbed down from his cab and went inside the convenience store. He needed to move, needed to be around other people, needed to do something normal and mundane that would convince him the world still made sense. The store was surprisingly crowded for a weekday morning, with a mix of truckers and local workers grabbing coffee before heading to their jobs. Denny poured himself a large cup from the self-serve machine, added enough sugar to make it almost drinkable, and wandered up and down the aisles without really seeing what was on the shelves. He ended up at the counter behind a woman who was buying lottery tickets and arguing with the clerk about which numbers were lucky. Denny waited patiently, sipping his coffee and trying not to think about the voices on the CB radio, about what they'd said about him remembering something when he reached the place where it happened. What place? What was he supposed to remember? His mind kept circling back to that question, trying to find an answer that made sense, but there was nothing, no memory of ever doing anything on Highway 666 that would explain what had happened to him last night. He'd driven that route dozens of times over the years, and it had always been just another stretch of highway, no different from 1,000 other stretches he'd driven across the country. The woman finally finished buying her tickets and left, and Denny stepped up to the counter. The clerk was a young guy, maybe 25, with a scraggly beard and tired eyes that suggested he'd been working the night shift. He rang up Denny's coffee without looking at him, his movements automatic and bored. Denny paid and was about to leave when something made him stop, some impulse he couldn't quite name. "Hey," Denny said, his voice coming out rougher than he'd intended. "You ever hear any stories about Highway 666? Like weird stuff that happens out there?" The clerk looked up at him, and for just a moment something flickered across his face, something that might have been recognition or might have been fear. but then it was gone, replaced by a carefully neutral expression. What kind of weird stuff? Denny hesitated. He didn't want to sound crazy. Didn't want to tell this kid about phantom trucks and voices on the CB radio that knew his name. But he also desperately needed to know if anyone else had experienced what he had, if there was any explanation for what had happened out there in the dark. Just, strange things. Abandoned vehicles, radio interference, that kind of thing. The clerk was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching Denny's face. Then he leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. "You saw something out there, didn't you, last night?" Denny felt his heart rate spike. "How did you know it was last night?" "Because it's always at night," the clerk said. "That's when they come out. That's when the road shows you what it really is." He glanced around the store, making sure no one else was close enough to hear. "Look, man, I don't know what you saw, and honestly, I don't want to know. But if you're smart, you'll find a different route. Highway 666 isn't right. It hasn't been right for a long time, maybe never was. People see things out there, hear things, and some of them don't come back. The ones that do, they're changed. You can see it in their eyes." Denny wanted to press him for more information, wanted to demand that the clerk tell him everything he knew about the highway and what happened to the drivers who didn't come back. But something in the kid's expression stopped him. The clerk looked genuinely frightened, and Denny realized that pushing too hard would just make him shut down completely. So instead, Denny just nodded and said, "Thanks for the warning." The clerk nodded back, already turning away to help the next customer. "Be careful out there, and whatever you do, don't stop on the highway after dark. Not for anything." Denny left the store and walked back to his truck, the clerk's words echoing in his head. Don't stop on the highway after dark. But he'd already done that, had already pulled over to check on that abandoned truck, and look where that had gotten him. He climbed back into his cab and sat there for a while, staring out the windshield at the other trucks in the lot, at the normal people living their normal lives, completely unaware that there were things out there on the road that defied explanation. His phone rang, making him jump. It was his dispatcher, a woman named Gloria who'd been with the company for 20 years, and took no nonsense from anyone. Denny answered, trying to keep his voice steady. "Denny, where are you?" Gloria's voice was sharp, impatient. "You should have picked up that load from Gallup 2 hours ago. The client is calling me asking where their shipment is." "Sorry, Gloria. I had some trouble on the road last night, had to pull over and rest. I'm at the Desert Rose now, about to head to the pickup." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Gloria spoke again, her voice had softened slightly. "What kind of trouble? Your truck okay?" Denny almost told her. Almost explained about the abandoned truck and the voices and the phantom chase down Highway 666. But he stopped himself just in time. If he told Gloria what had really happened, she'd think he was losing it. Would probably order him to come back to the terminal for a drug test and a psychological evaluation. And maybe she'd be right to do that. Maybe he was losing it. Maybe the whole thing had been some kind of stress-induced breakdown, and he needed help. "Just got tired," Denny said finally. "Needed to pull over before I fell asleep at the wheel. I'm good now. I'll pick up the load and have it delivered on schedule." Gloria made a skeptical noise but didn't push. "Fine, but don't make a habit of this, Denny. You're one of my best drivers, but even you can't just disappear for hours without calling in. The clients don't care about your excuses. They just want their freight delivered on time. I understand. It won't happen again. See that it doesn't." Gloria hung up without saying goodbye, which was typical for her. Denny set his phone down and started the truck. Time to get back to work, back to the job, back to pretending that everything was normal and that he hadn't spent the night being chased by something that shouldn't exist. The pickup went smoothly. The warehouse in Gallup had his paperwork ready, and the forklift operators loaded his trailer with pallets of auto parts in less than an hour. Denny did his inspection, signed the bills of lading, and was back on the road by noon. His route would take him south to Albuquerque, then east toward Santa Fe. If traffic was light and he didn't hit any delays, he'd have the load delivered by evening and could find a proper truck stop to park at for the night. Somewhere with lights and security cameras and other drivers around. Somewhere he wouldn't be alone. But first, he had to drive Highway 606 again. Had to go back through that stretch of desert where the abandoned truck had been sitting, where the voices had spoken his name over the CB radio. The dispatcher had routed him that way because it was the fastest option, the most direct path between Gallup and Albuquerque. Denny could have requested a different route, could have taken the long way around through Farmington and down through the mountains, but that would have added 3 hours to his drive and raised questions he didn't want to answer. So he was going back to the Devil's Highway. The sun was bright and hot as Denny merged onto Highway 666, heading south. In the daylight, the desert looked completely different from how it had appeared during the night. Instead of an endless black void filled with unseen threats, it was a landscape of stark beauty, all red rock and blue sky, and the occasional cluster of scrub brush clinging to life in the arid soil. Denny could see for miles in every direction, could spot the distant shapes of mesas and buttes rising from the desert floor like ancient monuments. It was hard to believe that this was the same road that had terrified him just hours earlier. In the light of day, with the sun beating down and the radio playing classic rock songs, it all seemed so normal, so safe. Denny tried to relax, tried to let the familiarity of driving soothe his jangled nerves. This was what he did, what he was good at. Driving trucks, hauling freight, covering the miles between one place and another. It was honest work, simple work, and it had never let him down before. He just needed to focus on that, on the road ahead and the load behind him and the destination waiting at the end of his route. He didn't need to think about phantom trucks or voices on the radio, or things with glowing eyes and broken necks. But as the miles rolled by and the sun started its slow descent toward the western horizon, Denny felt the unease creeping back in. He was getting close to the spot where he'd seen the abandoned truck, close to the place where everything had started to go wrong. He found himself watching the shoulder of the highway, looking for that dark shape against the desert, half expecting to see the old Kenworth still sitting there waiting for him. But there was nothing. Just empty road and empty desert and the occasional highway sign marking the miles to the next town. Denny was about 5 miles from where he'd seen the abandoned truck when his CB radio crackled to life. He tensed immediately, his hands tightening on the steering wheel, but it was just normal chatter from other truckers on the road. Someone was asking about road conditions up ahead. Someone else was complaining about the price of diesel. It was mundane and boring and exactly what Denny needed to hear. Proof that the world was still operating normally, that the CB was just a tool for communication between drivers, nothing more sinister than that. Then the chatter stopped. Abruptly, mid-sentence, like someone had flipped a switch and cut off all the voices. The CB went silent, not even static, just that same dead air that Denny had heard last night. He reached over to adjust the squelch, thinking maybe he'd lost the signal, but before his hand could touch the knob, a voice came through. "Hello, Denny." It was a different voice this time. Not the chorus of layered sounds he'd heard during the night, but a single voice, clear and distinct. A woman's voice, soft and gentle, almost friendly. But there was something wrong with it, something that made the hair on the back of Denny's neck stand up. It was too calm, too measured, like someone reading from a script. "We're glad you came back," the voice continued. We were worried you might try to avoid us, might take a different route, but here you are, right where you need to be." Denny grabbed the CB mic, his heart pounding. "Who is this? How do you know my name?" The woman's voice laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "We know everything about you, Denny Lyle. We know where you were born, where you went to school, the name of your first girlfriend. We know about your daughter, about how you only see her twice a month because you're always on the road. We know about the divorce, about how your wife left you because she said you loved the truck more than you loved her. We know all of it." Denny felt sick. This wasn't possible. This was information that no stranger could have. Details about his life that he'd never shared with anyone except his closest friends. How could someone on the CB radio know these things? How could they know about his daughter, about his failed marriage, about the choices he'd made that had led him to this life on the road? "What do you want from me?" Denny's voice came out shaky, barely controlled. "We want you to remember," the woman said. "We want you to go back to the place where it happened. We want you to face what you did." "I didn't do anything," Denny shouted into the mic. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," the voice said, and now it was changing, deepening, becoming multiple voices again, male and female and something in between, all speaking in perfect synchronization. "You know exactly what we're talking about. You've known since the moment you saw the truck last night. You've known since you heard us call your name. You're just afraid to remember, afraid to admit what you did." Denny looked up at the road ahead and felt his blood turn to ice. There, about a quarter-mile in front of him, was the abandoned truck. The same old Kenworth, sitting on the shoulder in exactly the same spot where he'd seen it last night. In broad daylight, with the sun still high in the sky, it should have looked ordinary, explainable. But it didn't. It looked wrong, out of place, like something that had been cut from a different reality and pasted onto this one. As Denny got closer, he could see that the truck hadn't moved at all since last night. It was in the exact same position, facing the same direction, with the same coating of dust on the windshield. And standing next to the driver's side door, as if she'd been waiting there all along, was a woman. She was wearing a highway patrol uniform, complete with the wide-brimmed hat and the reflective sunglasses that all state troopers seemed to favor. She was waving at Denny, motioning for him to pull over, and for one wild moment Denny thought about just blowing past her, about keeping his foot on the accelerator and putting as many miles as possible between himself and this cursed stretch of highway. But he couldn't do that. You didn't ignore a highway patrol officer, not if you wanted to keep your commercial driver's license. And maybe, just maybe, this was exactly what he needed. A real person, a representative of law and order, someone who could help him make sense of what was happening. Denny eased his truck onto the shoulder about 50 feet behind the abandoned Kenworth, set his air brake, and killed the engine. The patrol officer was walking toward him now, her stride confident and purposeful. Denny climbed down from his cab, his legs feeling shaky and unsteady, and waited for her to approach. As she got closer, he could see that she was probably in her 40s, with sharp features and auburn hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her name tag read Harlan, and there was something about the way she moved that suggested military experience, someone who'd seen combat and come out the other side harder and more capable than before. "Afternoon, sir," Officer Harlan said, her voice crisp and professional. "Is this your truck?" She gestured toward the abandoned Kenworth. "No, ma'am," Denny said, relief flooding through him. This was good. This was normal. A police officer investigating an abandoned vehicle, asking routine questions. "I actually stopped here last night to check on it. Thought maybe the driver needed help, but there was no one inside." Officer Harlan nodded slowly, her expression unreadable behind those reflective sunglasses. "Last night, you say?" What time was that? Around 2 in the morning, maybe 2:30, I was heading north to Farmington. And you didn't see anyone around the vehicle? No other cars or trucks? No, ma'am, just this truck sitting here empty. I tried to see if anyone needed help, but there was nobody there. Then I heard... Denny stopped himself. How could he explain about the voices on the CB radio without sounding insane? Heard what? Officer Harlan prompted, tilting her head slightly. Nothing, Denny said quickly. I just got spooked and left. Probably should have called it in, but I didn't have cell service out here. Officer Harlan was quiet for a moment, and Denny had the uncomfortable feeling that she was studying him, measuring him, trying to decide if he was telling the truth. Then she reached up and removed her sunglasses, and Denny found himself looking into eyes that were a startling shade of green, so bright they almost seemed to glow in the harsh desert sunlight. "Mr. Lyle," she said, and Denny felt his stomach drop because he hadn't told her his name. "I need you to be completely honest with me. Have you been drinking, taking any substances that might impair your ability to drive?" "No, ma'am, nothing like that. How did you know my name?" Officer Harlan smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's on the side of your truck, Mr. Lyle. Your company puts driver names on all their vehicles. Standard practice." Denny glanced back at his truck. She was right. There was a small placard on the driver's door with his name and his CDL number. He'd forgotten about that, hadn't even thought to check if that's how the voices had learned who he was. Relief washed over him again. There was a rational explanation after all. The voices on the CB had just been other truckers who'd seen his name on the truck and decided to mess with him. It was a cruel prank, nothing more. "I need you to come take a look at something, Mr. Lyle," Officer Harlan said, turning and walking toward the abandoned truck. "I want to get your opinion on what you saw last night." Denny followed her, grateful to have a normal explanation for what had happened, eager to help in any way he could. They walked up to the Kenworth, and Officer Harlan pulled out a flashlight even though it was broad daylight. She shone it through the driver's side window, illuminating the cab interior. "You said there was no one inside when you checked last night," she said. "Is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am, the cab was empty." "And you didn't notice anything unusual, anything that seemed out of place?" Denny looked through the window, trying to remember what he'd seen by flashlight in the dark. The cab looked the same as it had last night, dusty and abandoned, with no personal belongings visible. But now, in the daylight, he could see something he'd missed before. There were scratches on the inside of the windshield, long gouges in the glass that looked like they'd been made by fingernails, and on the driver's seat, almost invisible against the dark fabric, were stains that might have been oil, or might have been something else entirely. "What happened here?" Denny asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Officer Harlan turned to look at him, and in that moment Denny saw something in her expression that made his blood run cold. It wasn't the look of a police officer investigating a crime scene. It was the look of someone who knew exactly what had happened here, who had seen it before and would see it again. "That's what we're trying to figure out, Mr. Lyle," she said. "This truck has been here for 3 days. We've run the plates, tried to track down the owner, but there's no record of it. No registration, no insurance, no VIN number that matches anything in our database. It's like this truck doesn't exist, was never manufactured, never sold, never driven. Except here it is, sitting on the side of Highway 606, and no one can explain how it got here or where it came from." Denny took a step back from the truck, his mind reeling. 3 days? But that's impossible. I drove this route less than a week ago, and this truck wasn't here then, it just appeared last night. "Are you sure about that, Mr. Lyle? Are you absolutely certain this truck wasn't here before last night?" Denny opened his mouth to say yes, to insist that he would have noticed the abandoned truck on the side of the highway. but the words died in his throat. Because suddenly he wasn't sure. Suddenly he was questioning everything he remembered about his previous trips through this area. Had he really paid attention to the shoulder? Had he really looked closely at every vehicle parked on the side of the road? Or had he just been focused on his own driving, on making his delivery times, on getting from one place to another as quickly as possible? I don't know, Denny admitted. I thought I would have seen it, but maybe I just didn't notice. Officer Harlan nodded, as if this was the answer she'd been expecting. Memory is a funny thing, Mr. Lyle. We think we remember events clearly, think we know exactly what happened and when. But the truth is our brains are constantly rewriting the past, filling in gaps, creating narratives that make sense to us. And sometimes, when we encounter something that doesn't fit our understanding of how the world works, our minds do whatever they can to rationalize it, to make it seem normal. She walked around to the back of the abandoned truck and stood there waiting for Denny to join her. Reluctantly, he did. Officer Harlan pointed at the trailer doors. These were sealed when we first found the truck, she said. Locked from the outside with a padlock that looked like it had been there for years. We had to cut it off to get inside. She pulled on the door handle, and the trailer door swung open with a rusty screech. Do you want to know what we found? Denny didn't want to know. Every instinct he had was screaming at him to get back in his truck and drive away as fast as he could. But he also knew that he couldn't leave, not now, not when he was this close to understanding what was happening. So he nodded, not trusting his voice. Officer Harlan shone her flashlight into the dark interior of the trailer, and Denny leaned forward to look inside. At first, he couldn't make sense of what he was seeing. The trailer appeared to be empty, just bare metal walls and a wooden floor scarred with years of use. But then his eyes adjusted to the dim light, and he saw them. Words, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, scratched into the metal walls of the trailer. Names, dates, messages carved with desperate urgency by hands that must have been bleeding by the time they finished. Denny stepped closer, squinting to read the words. Most of them were just names, simple identifications of people who had been in this trailer at some point. But some of the messages were longer, more detailed. Tell my family I love them. I didn't deserve this. He's coming back. And there, near the front of the trailer, carved in letters 6 inches high, Denny Lyle was here. Denny's legs went out from under him. He would have fallen if Officer Harlan hadn't caught him, her strong hands gripping his arms and holding him upright. His mind was spinning, rejecting what his eyes were showing him. That was impossible. He'd never been in this trailer, had never carved his name in these walls. But there it was, his full name spelled out in crude letters, the metal around each stroke worn smooth, as if the carving was old, had been there for years. I don't understand, Denny gasped. I've never been in there. I've never seen this truck before last night. How is my name in there? Officer Harlan released him, letting him stand on his own. The question isn't how your name got in there, Mr. Lyle. The question is when. Because according to the wear pattern on those carvings, your name has been in that trailer for at least 10 years. Maybe more. 10 years. Denny tried to think back, tried to remember where he'd been 10 years ago, what routes he'd been driving, but his mind was a blank fog. 10 years ago would have been 2013, around the time his marriage was falling apart, when he'd been taking every load he could get just to stay away from home and avoid the fighting. He'd driven Highway 66 dozens of times that year, maybe hundreds. Could something have happened then? Could he have somehow ended up in that trailer and not remembered it? I need you to think very carefully, Mr. Lyle, Officer Harlan said, her voice taking on an urgent tone. Has anything strange happened to you on this highway before? Any lost time? Any gaps in your memory? Anything you can't explain?" Denny shook his head, but even as he did, something was tugging at the edges of his consciousness. Some memory that was trying to surface but couldn't quite break through. There was something. Some night, some drive, something that had happened that he'd forgotten or suppressed or simply refused to acknowledge. There was... Denny started, then stopped. The memory was too vague, too uncertain. There was one night, I think it was winter, maybe January or February of 2013. I was driving this route, heading north, and I lost about 4 hours. I thought I'd just fallen asleep without realizing it, pulled over somewhere and dozed off. But when I woke up, I was still driving, still moving down the highway, and I couldn't remember anything from the last 4 hours. Not a single mile of it. Officer Harlan's expression didn't change, but Denny saw something flicker in those two bright green eyes. "And you never told anyone about this? Never reported it to your company?" "No, I was afraid they'd think I was unsafe, that I was falling asleep at the wheel. I needed the job. I couldn't afford to lose it." "What else do you remember about that night?" Denny closed his eyes, trying to focus on the memory, trying to bring it into sharper detail. "It was cold. There was snow on the ground, and when I finally pulled into a truck stop and checked myself in the mirror, I had a bruise on my forehead, right here." He touched the spot above his left eye. "I figured I'd bumped my head on something when I was loading or unloading, but I couldn't remember doing it." "Anything else? Any other physical evidence that something had happened?" "My clothes smelled strange, like metal and diesel and something else I couldn't identify, and my hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold a cup of coffee." Denny opened his eyes and looked at Officer Harlan. I convinced myself it was nothing, just stress and exhaustion. But it wasn't nothing, was it? Officer Harlan was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small notebook, flipping through pages covered in tight, neat handwriting. "Mr. Lyle, in the past 15 years, 17 truck drivers have disappeared on Highway 66, just vanished, leaving their rigs on the side of the road with the engines still running. Some of them were found eventually, wandering in the desert miles from their trucks, with no memory of how they'd gotten there. Others were never found at all, and every single one of them, before they disappeared, reported the same things you've reported. Voices on the CB radio, phantom trucks that appeared and disappeared, lost time they couldn't account for." She closed the notebook and looked directly at Denny. "I'm not really a highway patrol officer, Mr. Lyle. My name is Maeve Harlan, and I'm an investigator with a federal task force that specializes in anomalous events. We've been monitoring Highway 666 for 7 years, trying to understand what's happening here, why this particular stretch of road seems to be a focal point for phenomena that we can't explain through conventional means." Denny stared at her, trying to process this new information. "You're saying this is real? That what I experienced last night, what I'm seeing now, it's actually happening?" "Yes," Maeve said simply. "It's real. We don't know what it is or why it happens, but it's real. And if your name is in that trailer, if you were part of whatever this is 10 years ago, then you're connected to it in a way we don't fully understand. The fact that you're having these experiences now, that the voices are calling to you, suggests that something is trying to bring you back to that moment, to make you remember what happened during those lost 4 hours." Denny felt like he was going to be sick. This was too much, too big, too far outside anything he could comprehend. "What am I supposed to do?" Maeve stepped closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You have 2 choices, Mr. Lyle. You can run. You can get in your truck right now and drive away, refuse to ever come back to this highway, spend the rest of your life trying to forget what you've seen and heard. Some drivers do that. They quit trucking altogether, find new careers, new lives, anything to get away from Highway 666. And for some of them it works. The experiences stop, the memories fade, and they manage to convince themselves it was all just stress and exhaustion, and too much time alone on the road. And the other choice? You can stay, Maeve said. You can help us understand what's happening here. You can let us monitor you, document your experiences, and maybe, if we're lucky, you can help us figure out what happened to those 17 drivers who disappeared. What happened to you during those 4 lost hours. She paused, her green eyes searching his face. The voices told you to remember, told you to go back to the place where it happened. I think they're right. I think if you want answers, if you want to understand what's happening to you, you need to remember, and I can help you do that. Denny looked back at the trailer, at his name carved into the metal wall alongside all those other names, all those other messages from people who'd been trapped in this dark space. He thought about those 17 drivers who'd disappeared, about the families they'd left behind, about the questions that would never be answered if someone didn't try to understand what was happening on Highway 66. He thought about running, about spending the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, wondering when the voices would come back, when the phantom truck would appear in his mirrors again. And he realized that he couldn't do that. He couldn't live that way, always afraid, always waiting for something terrible to happen. "Okay," Denny said finally. "I'll help. Tell me what you need me to do." Maeve Harlan led Denny away from the abandoned truck and back toward his rig, where she had a black SUV parked on the shoulder about 100 yards down the highway. Denny hadn't even noticed it when he'd pulled over, which struck him as odd now that he thought about it. How could he have missed a vehicle sitting right there in plain sight? But then again, he'd missed a lot of things lately, like the fact that his name had been carved into a trailer wall 10 years ago, or that he'd lost 4 hours of his life on this very highway and had somehow convinced himself it didn't matter. The SUV was unmarked, without any government plates or official insignia, but it had the look of a federal vehicle nonetheless. Maeve opened the back door and pulled out a laptop computer, setting it on the hood and booting it up. While they waited for it to load, she pulled out a thermos and poured 2 cups of coffee, handing one to Denny without asking if he wanted it. He took it gratefully, wrapping his hands around the warm cup even though the desert heat was already making him sweat. "What exactly is this task force you work for?" Denny asked, watching as Maeve typed in a series of passwords to unlock her computer. "I've never heard of any federal agency that investigates anomalous events." "That's because we don't advertise," Maeve said, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "Officially, we're a subdivision of the Department of Transportation, looking into traffic safety issues on rural highways. Unofficially, we investigate incidents that don't fit normal patterns, things that can't be explained by conventional accident reconstruction or criminal investigation. Highway 666 is one of our most active cases, has been for years." The laptop screen came to life, showing a map of the southwestern United States with Highway 606 highlighted in red. Along the route were dozens of colored pins, each representing some kind of incident. Maeve zoomed in on the stretch of highway where they were currently parked, and Denny could see that the pins were clustered here, in this exact area, more densely than anywhere else on the map. "This is ground zero," Maeve said, pointing at the screen. "Whatever's happening on Highway 666, it's centered right here, in this 5-mile stretch of road. Most of the disappearances, most of the anomalous sightings, most of the reports of lost time, they all happen within a few miles of where we're standing right now." Denny stared at the map, at all those colored pins representing all those incidents, all those other drivers who'd experienced something they couldn't explain. Why? What's special about this place? That's what we've been trying to figure out. Maeve clicked through several files, pulling up photographs and reports. The highway itself was built in 1962, part of a federal push to improve transportation infrastructure in rural areas. But before that, this was an old trading route used by Native American tribes. And before that, there are geological surveys that suggest this area has unusual magnetic properties. The rock formations beneath the highway contain high concentrations of magnetite, which can cause compass needles to spin and radio equipment to malfunction. She pulled up another file, this one showing a series of geological charts and seismic readings. About 15 years ago, there was a minor earthquake in this region. Nothing major, just a 3.2 on the Richter scale. But it opened up some underground caverns that hadn't been there before, or at least hadn't been accessible before. Since then, we've seen a significant increase in anomalous activity. Drivers reporting strange lights in the sky, CB radios picking up voices that shouldn't be there, vehicles breaking down for no reason, and then starting up again perfectly fine a few hours later. Denny sipped his coffee, trying to absorb all this information. So you're saying this is all natural? Some kind of geological phenomenon that's causing hallucinations or equipment malfunctions? I'm saying that's one theory, Maeve replied carefully. But it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain the abandoned vehicles that appear and disappear, or the messages carved into trailer walls by people who claim they were never there, or the fact that some drivers go missing and are found days later with no memory of where they've been, but with injuries that suggest they've been in some kind of struggle. She closed the laptop and looked directly at Denny. And it doesn't explain why your name was in that trailer, carved there 10 years ago, during a period when you admit you lost 4 hours of your life. Denny set down his coffee cup, his hands trembling slightly. What do you think happened to me during those 4 hours? Maeve was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. I think you encountered something on this highway, something that operates according to rules we don't understand yet. I think whatever it was took you somewhere, showed you something or did something to you, and then put you back in your truck and let you drive away. But it didn't erase your memory completely. Couldn't erase it, because some part of you still remembers. That's why the voices are calling to you now, why the phantom truck is chasing you. You're connected to this place, to whatever is happening here, and it wants you to come back. Come back where? To what? That's what we need to find out. Maeve pulled out a small device that looked like a modified GPS unit. This is a tracker. I want you to keep it in your truck, turned on at all times. It'll monitor your location, but it'll also record any electromagnetic anomalies in your immediate area, any fluctuations in radio frequencies, anything that might indicate you're experiencing another anomalous event. If something happens, if you see the phantom truck again, or hear the voices or lose time, this device will record it. Denny took the tracker, turning it over in his hands. It was heavier than he'd expected, with a small LCD screen and a series of buttons he didn't understand. And then what? If something happens, what am I supposed to do? You call me. Maeve handed him a business card with nothing on it but a phone number. Day or night doesn't matter. If you experience anything unusual, anything at all, you call that number immediately. I'll be monitoring the tracker remotely, so I'll know if something's happening, even if you can't call, but I need you to document everything you experience. Write it down, record it on your phone, whatever you can do to preserve the memory before it starts to fade. Before it starts to fade, Denny repeated. You're saying my memories aren't reliable? That whatever happened to me 10 years ago, I might not remember it accurately even if I try? Memory is complicated, Maeve said, especially memories of traumatic events. Our brains do whatever they can to protect us from psychological harm, And sometimes that means suppressing or altering memories of things that are too frightening or too painful to process. Add in the possibility of electromagnetic interference affecting neural pathways, and you've got a situation where even the person who experienced something might not be able to trust their own recollection of events. Denny thought about that, about how his mind had rationalized away the lost 4 hours back in 2013, had convinced him it was just fatigue and stress and nothing to worry about. How many other things had he forgotten or misremembered over the years? How much of his life was built on a foundation of false memories and suppressed truths? "I need to ask you something," Denny said. "Those 17 drivers who disappeared, the ones who were never found, do you think they're dead?" Maeve's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes suggested she'd been expecting this question. "I think some of them probably are, but some of them, I think they went somewhere. I think they crossed over into whatever space exists alongside this highway, whatever pocket dimension or parallel reality, or whatever the hell you want to call it, and they couldn't find their way back." "That's insane," Denny said. But even as he spoke the words, he knew he didn't really believe they were insane. Not after what he'd experienced. Not after seeing his own name carved into that trailer wall. "Yes," Maeve agreed. "It is insane, but that doesn't make it untrue." She checked her watch. "It's almost 4 o'clock. You should get back on the road, make your delivery. The tracker will record everything, and I'll be watching. If anything happens, call me." Denny nodded, pocketing the tracker and the business card. He started to walk back toward his truck, then stopped and turned around. "Why are you doing this? Why are you out here investigating something that everyone else probably thinks is just drivers making up stories or having hallucinations?" Maeve smiled, but it was a sad smile, one that carried years of burden. "Because 10 years ago, my brother was driving this highway. He was a trucker, just like you, hauling freight from Gallup to Albuquerque. His truck was found on the shoulder right here, engine still running, CB radio turned on, but my brother was gone. Never found him, never found any trace of where he went or what happened to him. So I quit my job, joined this task force, and I've been out here ever since trying to understand what happened to him and to all the others who've disappeared on this highway." She walked back to her SUV, opened the driver's door, then paused. "Your name was in that trailer, Mr. Lyle, carved alongside my brother's name. Whatever happened to you 10 years ago, whatever you can't remember, my brother was there too. So if you remember anything at all, I need you to tell me. Not just for your sake, but for his." With that, she climbed into the SUV and drove away, leaving Denny standing alone on the shoulder of Highway 666 with more questions than he'd started with. He walked back to his truck in a daze, climbed into the cab and sat there for several minutes trying to process everything Maeve had told him. His name in the trailer, her missing brother, 17 disappeared drivers, an entire federal task force investigating what sounded like something out of a science fiction novel. Denny looked at the tracker Maeve had given him, at its blinking green LED indicating it was active and recording. He thought about throwing it out the window, about refusing to be part of whatever this was, about just driving away and pretending none of this had happened. But he knew he couldn't do that. Not when his name was carved in that trailer. Not when there were answers out there somewhere waiting to be found. He started his truck, checked his mirrors, and pulled back onto the highway. He had a delivery to make in Albuquerque, a job to do, a life to live. He would make the delivery, would document his route and his hours like he always did, and if nothing strange happened, then maybe, just maybe, this would all turn out to be some kind of elaborate misunderstanding. But Denny knew better. Deep down, in a place below conscious thought, He knew that this was just the beginning. The voices had called to him, the phantom truck had chased him, and his name was waiting for him in that trailer, carved there by hands he couldn't remember using. Something had happened to him on this highway 10 years ago, and that something wasn't done with him yet. The sun was starting to sink toward the horizon as Denny drove south, painting the desert in shades of orange and red. He passed the spot where the abandoned truck had been sitting, but now there was nothing there, just empty shoulder and empty desert. Maeve must have had it towed away, taken somewhere for analysis, or just moved it to stop other curious drivers from pulling over to investigate. Denny found himself wondering what other evidence might be inside that trailer, what other names might be carved into those metal walls, what other messages desperate people had left behind. He'd been driving for about 20 minutes when his CB radio crackled to life. Denny tensed immediately, his hand moving toward the power switch to turn it off, but he stopped himself. If something was happening, if the voices were coming back, the tracker would record it. This might be exactly what Maeve needed, proof that the anomalous events were real and not just driver fatigue or psychological problems. Breaker 19, this is southbound Sally looking for a radio check. Anybody out there got their ears on? It was a normal voice, a woman trucker calling out for someone to talk to, nothing sinister or strange about it. Denny felt the tension drain out of his shoulders. He picked up the mic and keyed it. This is Denny, southbound on 666. I got you loud and clear, Sally. How's your day going? Oh, same old, Sally replied, her voice friendly and warm. Fighting the wind, fighting the heat, fighting to stay awake, just another day in paradise. Where you headed? Albuquerque got a load of auto parts that needs to be there by 7. You should make that easy. Traffic's light today, smooth sailing all the way down. There was a pause. Then Sally's voice came back, slightly more serious. Hey, Denny, you haven't seen anything weird out there, have you? On this stretch of highway? Denny's hand tightened on the steering wheel. What kind of weird? I don't know, just strange things. I've been driving this route for 15 years, and lately I've been seeing things that don't make sense. Trucks that appear and disappear, lights in the sky, voices on the radio that shouldn't be there. I'm starting to think maybe I've been on the road too long, Maybe it's time to retire, find a nice office job somewhere. Denny thought about telling her everything, about Maeve and the task force and the 17 missing drivers. But he stopped himself. If Sally didn't know about all that, maybe it was better to keep it that way. No point in scaring her if she was already considering leaving the profession. I haven't seen anything too strange, Denny lied. Just the usual desert weirdness, heat mirages, that kind of thing. Yeah, probably just that, Sally said. But Denny could hear the doubt in her voice. Well, you drive safe out there, Denny. Keep the shiny side up and the greasy side down. You too, Sally. Good luck with that retirement decision. The CB went silent again, and Denny was left alone with his thoughts. How many other drivers were out there experiencing the same things he was? How many of them were questioning their sanity, wondering if they should quit trucking before something terrible happened? And how many of them had already disappeared, had already crossed over into whatever space existed alongside Highway 666? The sun dropped below the horizon, and the desert went dark. Denny turned on his headlights, watching as the twin beams cut through the gathering gloom. He checked the tracker Maeve had given him, saw that the green LED was still blinking steadily, recording his location and monitoring for anomalies. Everything seemed normal, just him and the road and the steady hum of his engine. Then the CB crackled again. This time there was no voice, just static, but the static had a rhythm to it. a pattern that Denny's brain tried to interpret as language. He turned up the volume, listening closely, and realized that the static was forming words, actual words, buried beneath the white noise like a message encoded in the interference itself. Denny, turn around, come back, remember. It was the same voice from last night, that chorus of layered sounds speaking in perfect synchronization. Denny grabbed the mic, his heart pounding. Who are you? What do you want from me? The static shifted, reorganized itself into new patterns. We are the ones who wait. We are the ones you left behind. We are the ones who carved your name in the walls of the dark place, so you would never forget. Left behind where? I don't understand. You know. You've always known. You just don't want to remember because remembering means accepting what you did, what you failed to do, what you ran away from. Denny's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the steering wheel. I didn't run away from anything. I didn't do anything. Whatever you think happened, you're wrong. The voice laughed, that same horrible sound like breaking glass and grinding metal. Then why is your name in the trailer, Denny? Why did you carve it there along with all the others? Why did you promise to come back and then drive away, leaving us in the darkness, leaving us to wait and wait and wait? Denny looked at the tracker on his passenger seat, saw that the LED had changed from green to red and was blinking rapidly. Something was happening. Some electromagnetic anomaly that the device was detecting and recording. He needed to call Maeve, needed to tell her the voices were back, but his phone was in his pocket and he couldn't take his hands off the wheel. Not while his truck was shuddering like something was pushing against it from the outside. In his rearview mirror, Denny saw headlights. 2 bright beams cutting through the darkness, coming up fast behind him. The phantom truck was back, chasing him again, and this time Denny knew there would be no escape. This time, whatever was driving that truck wasn't going to let him get away. The headlights pulled alongside him, and Denny forced himself to look over at the other truck. It was the same old Kenworth from the shoulder, but now it was moving, keeping pace with him effortlessly. The driver's side window was dark, impenetrable, but Denny could see movement inside the cab, shapes that shifted and writhed like something was trying to take form. Then the window rolled down, and Denny saw who was driving. It was a man, or what had once been a man. He was tall and thin, with dark hair and a face that might have been handsome before whatever had happened to him. But his eyes were wrong, too bright, glowing with that same pale, sickly light Denny had seen before. And his smile, that terrible smile that stretched too wide across his face, showing too many teeth. The man raised one hand in a wave, casual and friendly, like they were just 2 truckers passing on the highway. Then he pointed at Denny, pointed directly at him through the windows of both trucks, and mouthed 3 words that Denny could read clearly despite the darkness and the distance. "I know you." Denny screamed. He couldn't help it. The sound tore out of his throat raw and desperate, and he jerked the steering wheel to the right, trying to put distance between himself and the nightmare truck. But the other rig matched his movement perfectly. Staying right alongside him, the driver still pointing, still smiling that impossible smile. The CB crackled with that voice again, but this time it was different. This time it was just one voice, male, familiar in a way that made Denny's blood run cold. "Hello, Denny. It's been a long time. 10 years, by my count. 10 years since that night when you and I and all the others were in the back of that trailer, trying to figure out how to get out, trying to understand where we were and how we'd gotten there. Do you remember now? Do you remember what you did?" "No," Denny whispered. "No, this isn't real. This isn't happening." "Oh, but it is happening. It's been happening for 10 years, Denny. Every night, every time another driver stops on this highway, we've been here, waiting, hoping that this time someone would remember, someone would come back and help us. But they never do. They drive away, just like you drove away, and they forget. They convince themselves it was just a dream, just stress, just their imagination. But you carved your name in those walls, Denny. You promised you'd find a way out, find a way to get help. And then you left us there, left us in the darkness, and you forgot. Denny's mind was reeling, fragments of memory trying to surface. Pieces of that lost night 10 years ago breaking through the barriers his brain had erected to protect him. He remembered cold metal walls. He remembered voices in the darkness, other people trapped with him, all of them truckers who'd stopped on Highway 6666 for one reason or another and had somehow ended up in that trailer. He remembered the smell of diesel and fear and something else, something wrong that had made his skin crawl. And he remembered the door opening, not the trailer doors, but another door, one that hadn't been there before, one that led somewhere else. He remembered stepping through that door, remembered the terrible choice he'd had to make, and he remembered running as fast as he could back to his truck, back to the real world, back to safety. And he remembered leaving them behind, all of them. The other truckers who'd been trapped in that trailer, who'd carved their names in the walls, who'd been waiting for someone to save them. He'd left them there, had driven away, and convinced himself it had never happened, that it was just a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and stress. "Oh my God," Denny gasped. I remember what I did." The man in the phantom truck smiled wider. "Good. That's good, Denny, because now that you remember, now that you know what you did, you can make it right. You can come back. You can open the door again and let us out. All you have to do is stop the truck. Stop the truck and come with me. It's easy. It's what you should have done 10 years ago." Denny looked ahead at the road stretching out before him, then at the tracker on his passenger seat with its frantically blinking red LED. Maeve had said to call her if anything happened, had said she'd be monitoring the tracker remotely. She would know something was wrong. She would know he needed help. All he had to do was keep driving, keep moving, don't stop no matter what the voice said. But the guilt was crushing him. The memory of those faces in the darkness, those other truckers who'd looked at him with such hope when he'd found the door, who'd believed he was going to save them, and he'd abandoned them. He'd chosen his own safety over theirs, had run away and left them in that terrible place. "I'm sorry," Denny said, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know what to do. I was scared. I thought if I got out, if I got back to my truck, I could call for help. I thought I could come back with the police, with someone who could help. But then I couldn't remember. I couldn't remember any of it." "But you remember now," the man said, his voice gentle, almost kind. "And now you can fix it. Now you can do what you should have done all along. Just stop the truck, Denny. Stop the truck and come back to us. We've been waiting for you. We've been waiting for so long." Denny's foot moved toward the brake pedal. It would be so easy. Just stop the truck, get out, walk over to the Phantom Kenworth and climb inside. Go back through that door, back into the darkness, and finally do the right thing. Finally be the person he should have been 10 years ago instead of the coward who'd run away. But then Denny thought about his daughter, about seeing her twice a month, about the way her face lit up when he brought her presents from his trips, about the life he'd built, imperfect as it was, and about the fact that if he stopped now, if he went with the man in the phantom truck, he would never see her again. He would disappear like those 17 other drivers, would become another mystery, another unsolved case, another name on Maeve's map. "No," Denny said, his voice stronger now. "No, I'm not stopping. I'm sorry for what I did. Sorry I left you there, but I can't fix it by disappearing too. I'm going to get help. I'm going to call Maeve, tell her everything I remember, and we're going to figure out how to get you out. But I'm not stopping this truck." The man's smile faded. The Phantom Kenworth swerved closer, so close that Denny could hear metal scraping against metal as the two trucks touched. The voice on the CB became a roar, no longer gentle, no longer kind. "You will stop. You will come back. You owe us. You promised." Denny grabbed his phone with one hand, keeping the other on the wheel, and dialed the number on Maeve's card. It rang once, twice, and then her voice came through, sharp and alert. "Denny, what's happening?" "It's here. The truck is here, and I remember. I remember what happened 10 years ago. I remember the trailer and the other drivers and the door. I remember everything. Where are you? What's your location?" Denny looked at his GPS. "Mile marker 247 heading south. It's trying to force me off the road, trying to make me stop. Don't stop." Maeve's voice was urgent. "Whatever you do, don't stop the truck. I'm tracking your location. I'm sending help, but you need to keep moving. The anomaly can't affect you if you stay in motion. That's why the disappeared drivers always stopped. That's how it gets you." The Phantom truck slammed into Denny's trailer, the impact strong enough to push him toward the shoulder. Denny fought the wheel, his arms screaming with effort as he kept his rig on the highway. In the Phantom truck's cab, he could see the driver clearly now, could see that it wasn't just one man, but many, all of them overlapping, all of them occupying the same space, all of them the drivers who'd been trapped in that trailer 10 years ago. And in the center of them all, Denny could see another face. Younger, with the same green eyes as Maeve, her brother. The trucker who'd disappeared 10 years ago, whose name was carved in the trailer wall next to Denny's. "Help us," the brother mouthed, his lips moving in synchronization with all the others. "Please. We're still there. We're still trapped. We're still waiting." Denny kept driving, kept fighting to stay on the road, kept the phone pressed to his ear as Maeve talked him through it. The Phantom truck stayed alongside him for another mile, then 2, the faces in the cab becoming clearer, more defined, more desperate. But Denny didn't stop. He kept his foot on the accelerator, kept his hands on the wheel, kept moving forward. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the Phantom truck was gone. The CB went silent. The desert was empty and dark again. Nothing but Denny's headlights cutting through the night. The tracker on his passenger seat stopped blinking red and returned to steady green. "It's gone," Denny said into the phone, his voice shaking. "It just disappeared." "Keep driving," Maeve said. "Don't stop until you reach Albuquerque. I'll meet you there. And Denny, you did good. You didn't stop. You didn't let it take you." "But they're still there," Denny said. "Your brother, all of them. They're still trapped in that place. I left them there 10 years ago, and they're still there." "I know," Maeve said quietly. "But now we have something we didn't have before. We have a witness who remembers. We have someone who can tell us what happened, how to open that door, how to get them out. You're going to help me save them, Denny. You're going to help me bring my brother home." Denny drove the rest of the way to Albuquerque in silence, the phone still connected. Maeve's presence on the other end a lifeline, keeping him tethered to reality. The memories were flooding back now, all the details he'd suppressed for 10 years, all the pieces of that terrible night. The trailer, the door, the choice he'd made, and the faces of the people he'd left behind. He would have to live with that guilt for the rest of his life. But maybe, just maybe, he could make it right. Maybe he could help Maeve find a way to open that door again, to pull her brother and all the others back from wherever they'd been trapped for the last decade. As Denny pulled into the delivery dock in Albuquerque, he saw Maeve's black SUV already waiting for him. She got out as he parked, and for the first time since he'd met her, Denny saw something other than professional composure in her expression. He saw hope. They sat in a truck stop diner on the outskirts of Albuquerque, the kind of place that stayed open 24 hours and served coffee that was always too hot and food that was always too greasy. It was nearly midnight, and the diner was mostly empty except for a few truckers scattered at different tables, each of them lost in their own worlds of exhaustion and routine. Denny had a plate of eggs and toast in front of him that he hadn't touched, and Maeve had a laptop open on the table between them, the screen showing a series of documents and photographs that Denny couldn't quite focus on. His hands were still shaking. They'd been shaking since he'd climbed down from his truck in the delivery dock, since Maeve had taken one look at him and insisted they go somewhere to talk, somewhere public and well-lit, where whatever haunted Highway 606 couldn't follow them. Denny had wanted to argue, wanted to say that he'd already delivered his load and fulfilled his obligation, and that he just wanted to go home and sleep for a week. But he knew he couldn't do that. Not now. Not when the memories were flooding back. Not when he finally understood what had happened to him 10 years ago. Maeve had been typing on her laptop for the last 10 minutes, occasionally glancing up at Denny and asking him questions about what he remembered, documenting everything he said with the clinical precision of someone who'd been chasing this mystery for years. Denny did his best to answer, to put into words the fragmented images and sensations that were emerging from the dark corners of his memory. But it was like trying to describe a nightmare to someone who'd never had one. How could you explain what it felt like to be trapped in a space that wasn't quite real, surrounded by people who were there but also not there, facing a door that led somewhere that defied all logic and reason? "Tell me about the door again," Maeve said, her fingers poised over the keyboard. "You said it wasn't there at first, that it just appeared. What did it look like?" Denny closed his eyes, forcing himself to go back to that night, to that terrible moment in the trailer when everything had changed. It was just a rectangle of light at first, like someone had cut a hole in the wall and there was brightness on the other side. But the light wasn't normal. It was too white, too clean, like it was coming from somewhere that didn't have shadows. And it was humming, I remember that. This low vibration that you could feel in your bones. How many of you were in the trailer at that point? 6? No, 7. There were 7 of us. Denny opened his eyes and looked at Maeve. Your brother was one of them, Caleb. He was the first one I met when I woke up in there. He'd been there longer than the rest of us. Had already been trying to figure out what was happening, how we'd gotten there. Maeve's expression didn't change, but Denny saw her jaw tighten slightly. What did Caleb tell you about how he'd ended up in the trailer? He said he'd stopped to help another trucker, saw a rig broken down on the shoulder, pulled over to see if they needed assistance. He remembers walking up to the truck, remembers knocking on the door, and then nothing. Next thing he knew, he was in the trailer with the rest of us, and none of us could figure out how we'd gotten there or where we were. Denny picked up his coffee cup, wrapped his hands around it for warmth, even though the diner was overheated. We tried everything to get out. We banged on the walls, tried to force the doors open, even tried to tear a hole in the floor with our belt buckles. But nothing worked. The metal was too thick, the doors were sealed from the outside, and there were no windows. No way to see where we were or if anyone was coming to help us. We were just stuck there in the dark, with no food, no water, nothing. How long were you in there? I don't know. Time didn't work right in that place. It felt like hours, maybe days, but it could have been minutes for all I know. We lost track. Some of us started to panic, started screaming and crying and saying we were going to die in there. Others got quiet, just sat against the walls with their eyes closed, maybe praying or maybe just trying to preserve their energy. And all the while, we could hear things outside the trailer. Voices, but not human voices. Sounds like wind, but not wind. Footsteps that came and went, but never got any closer. Maeve typed quickly, her fingers flying across the keyboard. And that's when the door appeared? When you were at your lowest point? Yeah, we'd been in there long enough that some of us were getting dehydrated, getting confused. One guy, I don't remember his name, he'd started talking to himself, having conversations with people who weren't there. That's when the light appeared. Just a rectangle on the wall, bright and clean, and somehow inviting despite how wrong it felt. And then the rectangle became a door, an actual door with a handle, and we could see through it to the other side. What did you see? Through the door? Denny was quiet for a long moment, trying to find the words. Nothing, and everything. It was like looking into a space that shouldn't exist, a place between places. There were shapes in there, forms that might have been buildings or might have been something else entirely. And there were sounds, these low harmonic tones that made you feel sick if you listened to them too long. But there was also a path, clear as day, leading away from the door and disappearing into the distance. Like someone had made it specifically for us. Like we were supposed to walk through and follow it wherever it led. Did anyone go through? Not at first. We were all scared, all arguing about what to do. Some of us thought it was a trap, that whatever had put us in the trailer was trying to lure us somewhere worse. Others thought it was our only chance, that we'd die in the trailer if we didn't take the risk. Caleb, your brother, he was the one who finally made the decision. He said he'd go through first, scout it out, see if it was safe, and if it was, he'd come back and get the rest of us. Denny swallowed hard, the memory vivid now, no longer suppressed or distorted. But I stopped him. I said I'd go instead. I was younger, faster, and I'd worked as a volunteer firefighter for a few years, so I knew how to handle dangerous situations. At least that's what I told myself. Really, I just wanted to be the hero. I wanted to be the one who saved everyone. So you went through the door? Yeah, I went through. Denny set down his coffee cup, his hands trembling so badly he was afraid he'd spill it. And the second I stepped through, everything changed. The trailer disappeared behind me, just vanished like it had never been there. I was standing on this path in the middle of that impossible space, and I could hear the others calling to me from somewhere far away, but I couldn't see them anymore. I couldn't see the door. What did you do? I ran. I ran as fast as I could down that path, trying to find a way out, trying to find help. And the further I ran, the more the space changed around me. The shapes started to look more like buildings, like structures, and I started to see things moving in the distance. Figures that might have been human or might have been something else. And I kept running until I saw another light, another door, and I went through it without thinking. Denny looked up at Maeve, saw the intensity in those green eyes, saw how badly she needed to hear this. When I came out the other side, I was standing next to my truck on Highway 666. It was early morning, the sun was just coming up, and everything was normal again. My truck was right where I'd left it. Engine still running, CB radio still on. It was like no time had passed at all, like the whole thing had been a dream, and that's what I told myself it was. I convinced myself I'd fallen asleep, had some kind of vivid nightmare, and that's why I couldn't remember the last few hours. But you left them there, Maeve said quietly. You came back through the door alone, and you left the others trapped in the trailer. I didn't know. Denny's voice cracked. I swear to God I didn't know. I thought if I got out, if I got back to the real world, I could call for help. I could tell someone what had happened, get the police involved, mount a rescue operation. But when I tried to tell people about it, when I tried to explain, the memories started to fade. Within a few hours, I could barely remember what had happened. Within a few days, I'd convinced myself it was just stress and exhaustion. And within a few weeks, I'd forgotten about it entirely. Maeve closed her laptop, her expression unreadable. The space between. That's what we call it in the task force. The place you described, the impossible space with the path and the shapes. We've had reports of it before from the few drivers who've experienced anomalous events and managed to remember enough to tell us about it. But you're the first person who's been able to describe it in detail, who's been able to tell us about the door from both sides. She pulled out a folder from her bag and spread several photographs across the table. They showed the abandoned Kenworth, both exterior and interior shots, with special attention paid to the names carved into the trailer walls. Denny could see his own name there, along with Caleb's and 5 others he didn't recognize. "These are the 7 names carved in that trailer," Maeve said. 7 truckers who all went missing on Highway 6666 between January and March of 2013. 7 people who were never found, who left no trace except their abandoned trucks and these names. 6 of them are still missing. But you came back. Why? Denny asked desperately. Why did I come back and they didn't? What made me different? That's what we need to figure out. Maeve tapped one of the photographs. The door you described, the one that appeared in the trailer and led to the space between, it's not random. Our research suggests it only appears under specific conditions, when certain electromagnetic thresholds are met and when there are people present who fit a particular psychological profile. Truckers who are isolated, who've been on the road too long, who are vulnerable in some way. She pulled out another document, this one showing a complex chart of dates and locations. Every disappearance on Highway 606 has happened during a specific phase of the solar cycle, when magnetic activity from the sun interacts with the magnetite deposits in the rock formations beneath the highway. It creates a kind of resonance field that can, under the right conditions, open doorways to other spaces, other realities, other dimensions, whatever you want to call them. Denny stared at the chart, trying to make sense of the technical jargon. So, this is all natural? Just some kind of weird geological phenomenon? The doorways might be natural, Maeve said. But what's on the other side isn't. The space between, the figures you saw moving in the distance, the structures that looked like buildings, that's something else entirely. Something that exists alongside our reality, occupying the same space but separated by some kind of dimensional barrier. And when the doorways open, things can move between the 2 spaces, including people. The phantom truck, Denny said, understanding dawning. The thing that's been chasing me, the faces I saw in the cab, that's them. That's your brother and the others, trying to get back, trying to use the doorways to return to our reality. Partially, Maeve said, but it's more complicated than that. When someone gets trapped in the space between, they don't stay static. They change, adapt to that environment, become part of it in ways we don't fully understand. The people you saw in the phantom truck, they're not quite the same as they were when they disappeared. They're caught between 2 states, 2 realities, and they need something from our side to complete their return. What do they need? Maeve looked at him directly. They need the person who left them there to come back and open the door from the other side. They need you, Denny. That's why the voices have been calling to you, why the phantom truck has been chasing you. You're the key. You're the one who can bring them home. Denny felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. You want me to go back. You want me to drive Highway 626 again, find that door, and go through it. I want my brother back, Maeve said, her voice tight with emotion. I want all of them back. And you're the only person who knows how to open the door. who has the connection to that space that can make it work. You're the only chance they have. I can't, Denny said, shaking his head. I can't go back there. You don't know what it's like, that place, the way it makes you feel. It's wrong in a way I can't even describe. And what if I can't get back? What if I go through the door and end up trapped there like they are? That's a risk, Maeve admitted. But we'll take precautions. We'll monitor you with multiple tracking devices, maintain constant radio contact, and I'll be right there on the highway with a full support team. The moment you signal that you found them, that you have the door open, we'll pull you back. We won't let you get trapped. Denny wanted to say no, wanted to refuse, wanted to go home and forget any of this had ever happened. But he couldn't. He'd lived with the guilt of abandoning those people for 10 years, even if he hadn't consciously remembered it until now. And now that he did remember, now that he knew they were still out there in that terrible space waiting for someone to save them, he couldn't walk away again. When? Denny asked quietly. Tonight, Maeve said. The solar activity is peaking again, same conditions as 10 years ago. If we're going to open the door, if we're going to get them back, it has to be tonight. 3 hours later, Denny was back on Highway 666, driving north through the darkness toward the spot where the abandoned Kenworth had been sitting. His truck was equipped with 6 different tracking devices, 3 CB radios all tuned to different frequencies, and a satellite phone that maintained a direct connection to Maeve's team. In his pocket, he had a compass that would supposedly tell him if he was crossing into the space between, and strapped to his chest was a harness with a cable attached that Maeve's technical team swore would act as a lifeline, allowing them to pull him back if he couldn't find his way out on his own. Denny had no idea if any of this technology would actually work. Maeve had admitted that most of their equipment failed when exposed to the anomalous conditions around the doorways, that they were essentially operating blind and hoping that this time would be different. But it was all they had, and Denny had agreed to try. The highway was empty, just like it had been every other time Denny had driven this route at night. No other vehicles, no lights except his own headlights cutting through the darkness. No signs of human presence for miles in any direction. It should have been peaceful, meditative even, but instead it felt ominous, like the desert itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen. "How are you doing, Denny?" Maeve's voice came through the CB clear and steady. "I'm okay," Denny lied. "About 15 miles from the target location. Remember the protocol. When you see the door, when you feel the pull, you call it in immediately. Don't try to be a hero. Don't try to handle it alone. We're here to support you." "Copy that." Denny drove on, his hands tight on the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the shoulder for any sign of the abandoned truck. But he knew it wouldn't be there, not physically. The truck had been towed away, taken to some secure facility for analysis. What he was looking for was something else. Some indication that the doorway was opening, that the barrier between realities was thinning enough for him to cross over. He was about 5 miles from the target location when his compass started to spin. The needle whipped around in circles, unable to find north, and Denny felt a familiar sensation wash over him. The air pressure in the cab changed, became heavier, and he could feel that same low vibration he'd felt 10 years ago in the trailer. The doorway was opening. "Maeve, I'm getting anomalous readings on the compass. I think it's starting." "Copy that. All teams, be advised, subject is entering the anomaly zone. Maintain visual contact and prepare for extraction protocol." Denny looked in his rearview mirror and saw Maeve's black SUV about a quarter mile behind him, along with 2 other vehicles that had been following at a distance. They were all staying back, maintaining what Maeve had called a safe perimeter, close enough to respond if something went wrong, but far enough away that they wouldn't get pulled into the anomaly themselves. The CB crackled, and Denny heard that familiar chorus of voices, layered and synchronous, speaking as one. "Denny, you came back. We knew you would. We've been waiting." "I'm here," Denny said into the mic, his voice shaking. "I'm here to help. I'm here to bring you home." "Then stop the truck, Denny. Stop the truck and open the door. It's time." Denny looked ahead and saw it. The same rectangle of white light he remembered from 10 years ago, hovering in the air about 50 feet above the highway. But this time it wasn't inside a trailer. This time it was just hanging there in space, a door to nowhere, bright and clean and impossibly wrong. And standing beneath it, visible in the glow of Denny's headlights, was a figure. It was Caleb, Maeve's brother. He looked exactly as he had 10 years ago, wearing the same clothes, the same expression of desperate hope. He was waving at Denny, motioning for him to stop, to get out of the truck, to come to the door. Denny eased off the accelerator, his heart pounding. This was it. This was the moment. He could keep driving, could refuse to stop just like Maeve had told him to do during the last encounter. Or he could do what he'd come here to do, what he'd promised he would do. He could stop the truck and face the door and try to bring those people home. "I'm stopping," Denny said into the CB, addressing both the voices from the space between and Maeve's team. "I'm going to open the door." "Denny, wait," Maeve's voice came through, urgent and worried. But Denny was already setting his air brake, already killing the engine, already climbing down from the cab. The desert air hit him like a physical force, hot and dry despite the late hour, carrying with it that same smell of metal and diesel and something else, something wrong that made his stomach turn. Caleb was still standing beneath the door, still waving, still pleading silently for Denny to help him. Denny took a step forward, then another, the cable attached to his harness playing out behind him. He could hear Maeve shouting something over the satellite phone, could hear the sounds of vehicles stopping and doors opening as her team prepared to intervene, but it all seemed very far away, muted and distant like he was hearing it through water. "That's it, Denny," the voices said, no longer coming from the CB but from the air itself, surrounding him, penetrating him. "Just a little closer, just a few more steps. Then you can open the door and we can all go home." Denny was about 10 feet from Caleb when he noticed something that made him stop cold. Caleb wasn't casting a shadow. Despite the bright glow of the door above him, despite Denny's headlights shining directly on him, there was no shadow on the ground. And when Denny looked more closely, he realized that Caleb wasn't quite solid. He could see through him, just slightly, like looking at someone through frosted glass. "You're not really here," Denny said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're still in the space between. This is just a projection, just something you're showing me to get me to open the door." Caleb's expression changed. The hope faded, replaced by something harder, something desperate. "Does it matter? We're trapped, Denny. We've been trapped for 10 years in a place that never ends, walking paths that lead nowhere, surrounded by things we don't understand. We need to get out. We need you to help us get out." "I want to help you," Denny said. "That's why I'm here. But Maeve said the door has to be opened from both sides, that I have to go through to bring you back. Is that true?" Caleb didn't answer, and in that silence Denny understood. It was a trap. It had always been a trap. The door would open if Denny stepped through it, would allow Caleb and the others to cross over into reality, but Denny would be left behind in the space between, trapped just like they'd been trapped for the last 10 years. The exchange would be permanent. 1 life for 7, Denny's freedom for theirs. "I'm sorry," Denny said, taking a step back. "I'm sorry this happened to you. I'm sorry I left you there 10 years ago. But I can't do this. I can't trade places with you." Caleb's form flickered. becoming less solid. You have to. You owe us. You promised you'd come back. You promised you'd save us. The door above them pulsed, growing brighter, and Denny could feel the pull intensifying, could feel something trying to drag him forward, trying to force him through the doorway. He grabbed the cable attached to his harness and pulled hard, signaling Maeve's team to reel him back in. I know I owe you, Denny said, fighting against the pull. And I'll find another way. Maeve will find another way. But I'm not going through that door. The voices rose to a roar, no longer words, but just raw sound, anger and betrayal and desperation all mixed together. Caleb's projection shattered like glass, breaking apart into fragments that dissolved in the desert air. The door pulsed once more, twice, and then began to shrink, the white light dimming, the rectangle growing smaller and smaller until it was just a pinpoint and then nothing at all. The cable went taut as Maeve's team pulled, and Denny stumbled backward, away from where the door had been, away from the spot where Caleb had stood. His legs gave out and he fell to the ground, his hands scraping on the asphalt, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind him, he could hear running footsteps, voices shouting, and then Maeve was there, kneeling beside him, checking to make sure he was okay. I couldn't do it, Denny said, looking up at her. I couldn't save them. Your brother, all of them, they're still trapped there and I couldn't save them. Maeve's expression was complicated, pain and relief fighting for dominance. You did the right thing. If you'd gone through that door, we would have lost you too, and we still wouldn't have a way to get them back. But they're still there. They're still suffering. I know. Maeve helped him to his feet, her grip strong and steady. But now we have more information. We know the door can be opened from this side. We know it requires a specific person with a specific connection to those who are trapped. And we know that trading one life for 7 isn't a viable solution. We'll find another way, Denny. I promise you, we'll find another way. They walked back to Denny's truck together, Maeve's team following behind, already discussing what had happened, already analyzing the data from their instruments. Denny climbed back into his cab and sat there for a long moment, his hands on the steering wheel, looking out at the empty highway stretching ahead into the darkness. He thought about Caleb and the others, trapped in that terrible space for 10 years, waiting for rescue that might never come. He thought about the choice he'd made, to save himself instead of them, and wondered if he'd made the right decision, or if he was just a coward twice over. But he also thought about his daughter, about seeing her again, about having the chance to be a father even if he was only a part-time one. He thought about the life he'd built, imperfect as it was, and about the fact that he still had time to make things right, to find a way to help Maeve rescue her brother and the others without sacrificing himself in the process. The CB crackled one last time, and Denny tensed, expecting to hear the voices again, but it was just Maeve calling from her SUV. Go home, Denny. Get some rest. We'll be in touch in a few days to debrief, to go over everything that happened and figure out our next steps. And Denny, thank you for coming back, for trying, for not giving up on them. Denny keyed the mic. I haven't given up. I won't give up. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, we'll find a way to get them out, I promise. He started his truck and pulled back onto the highway, heading south toward home. In his rearview mirror, he could see Maeve's SUV and the other vehicles falling into formation behind him, escorting him away from the anomaly zone, making sure he made it safely out of the area where the doorways could open. As Denny drove, he thought about Highway 600C6, about the Devil's Highway, about all the drivers who'd disappeared over the years, and all the families who'd been left behind with questions that had no answers. He thought about the space between, that impossible realm that existed alongside reality, and about the things that lived there, the structures and figures and whatever else occupied that terrible place. And he thought about the door, about how it had opened for him twice now, about how it knew his name and his connection to those who were trapped. Maeve had said they'd find another way, but Denny wasn't sure there was another way. Maybe the only solution was the one he'd refused to accept. Maybe the only way to save 7 lives was to sacrifice one. But not tonight. Tonight he would drive home. Tonight he would call his daughter and tell her he loved her. Tonight he would sleep in his own bed and dream of normal things, of roads that didn't lead to impossible places, and trucks that didn't chase you through the darkness with the faces of the dead looking out from their cabs. Tomorrow, or next week, or next month, he would come back to Highway 666. He would work with Maeve to understand the anomalies, to map the doorways, to find some way to rescue her brother and the others without dooming himself in the process. It might take years, it might never work, but he would try, because that's what truckers did. They kept moving forward, kept pushing through the night, kept their hands on the wheel and their eyes on the road even when everything around them was falling apart. They didn't give up, they didn't quit, they just kept driving, mile after mile, load after load, doing the job that needed to be done. And if the voices came back, if the phantom truck appeared in his mirrors again, if the door opened one more time and offered him that terrible choice, Denny would face it. Not tonight, but someday when he was ready, when he'd made his peace with what he'd done and what he'd failed to do. For now, he just drove. South on Highway 666, away from the anomaly zone, away from the space between, away from the choices he couldn't yet make. The stars overhead were bright and clear. The desert was quiet, and for a little while the world felt almost normal again. But Denny knew better. He'd seen what lurked in the darkness. He'd heard the voices calling his name. He'd looked through the door and seen what waited on the other side, and he knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The Devil's Highway wasn't done with him yet. Wade Coltrane had been watching the storm build for the last hour, tracking its progress across the Arizona desert like a predator stalking prey. Dark clouds piled up on the western horizon, anvil-shaped thunderheads that rose so high they seemed to scrape against the ceiling of the sky. Lightning flickered inside them, brief flashes of white light that illuminated the clouds from within, and even from 40 miles away, Wade could see the gray curtain of rain falling beneath the storm system, obscuring everything it touched. It was the kind of storm that made veteran truckers pull over and wait it out, the kind that could flip a fully loaded rig if you were unlucky enough to catch a crosswind at the wrong moment. Wade was 48 years old and had been driving trucks for nearly 30 years, long enough to know when to push through weather and when to find a safe place to park. He'd driven through blizzards in Wyoming, dust storms in West Texas, and once, memorably, through the edge of a hurricane in Louisiana that had nearly torn the doors off his cab. But desert storms were different. They came on fast and hit hard, with winds that could gust up to 70 or 80 miles per hour, and rain so heavy you couldn't see the hood of your own truck. And Highway 666, the stretch of road he was currently traveling, was particularly bad during storm season. The highway ran through open country with no natural windbreaks, no place to hide when the weather turned mean. He checked his GPS looking for the nearest town or truck stop where he could pull off and wait out the storm. The screen showed nothing for the next 60 miles except highway and empty desert, which wasn't unusual for this part of Arizona. The population out here was sparse, scattered across vast distances, with small towns separated by hours of driving through nothing but scrub brush and red rock. Wade knew he should have stopped back in Holbrook, should have grabbed dinner and waited to see if the storm would pass before continuing on. But he'd been behind schedule and his dispatcher had been writing him about delivery times. Now he was going to pay for that decision. The wind hit first, a sudden gust that pushed against the side of Wade's trailer hard enough to make the whole rig shudder. Wade tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles going white as he fought to keep the truck in his lane. The wind came in waves after that, buffeting the rig from different angles, making it feel like something was physically shoving at him, trying to push him off the road. Wade eased off the accelerator, dropping his speed from 65 down to 45, then down to 30. Better to go slow and stay on the road than push too hard and end up in a ditch. The rain came next, so sudden and so heavy it was like someone had thrown a bucket of water over the windshield. Wade's wipers were on their highest setting, but they could barely keep up, sweeping back and forth in a frantic rhythm that still left more water than glass visible. The road ahead disappeared into a wall of gray, and Wade found himself driving almost blind, navigating by the faint white line at the edge of the pavement and hoping to God there was nothing stopped in his lane. Thunder rolled across the desert, so loud Wade could feel it in his chest, and lightning split the sky directly overhead. The flash was bright enough to leave after-images burned into Wade's retinas, and for a moment he was completely disoriented, unsure which direction he was facing or if he was even still on the road. He pumped the brakes gently, trying to slow down without losing traction on the wet pavement, and that's when he saw it. A sign on the side of the road, illuminated briefly by another flash of lightning. It was old and weathered, the kind of sign that had been standing beside highways since the 1950s, and it read, "Desert Rose Motel, 2 miles, vacancy." Wade had driven Highway 666 dozens of times over the years, and he'd never seen that sign before. Never heard of any motel called the Desert Rose in this area. But then again, visibility was terrible, and he was focused on just keeping his truck on the road, so maybe he'd missed it on previous trips. And right now, with the storm getting worse by the minute and his visibility down to almost nothing, Wade didn't much care whether he'd seen the sign before or not. He just needed to get off the highway before he lost control of the rig or ran into something he couldn't see. 2 miles later, right where the sign had promised, Wade saw lights glowing through the rain. A cluster of buildings set back from the highway, arranged in the classic L shape of an old roadside motel. There was a neon sign near the road that spelled out Desert Rose in faded pink letters, with a smaller sign below it that flickered between vacancy and no vacancy, in a rhythm that seemed almost hypnotic. Wade turned off the highway onto a gravel driveway, his tires crunching on the wet stones, and pulled into the parking lot. The motel looked like something out of another era. Single-story construction, maybe a dozen rooms total, each with its own door painted in peeling turquoise paint, and a large window covered by thick curtains. The office was at the near end of the L, identifiable by the word "office" painted on the door, and a light that shone through the window. There were no other vehicles in the parking lot, no cars or trucks, which struck Wade as odd given that he couldn't be the only person seeking shelter from the storm. But maybe other drivers had pushed through, or maybe they'd stopped at different locations. Either way, Wade was just grateful to have found a place to park. He set his air brake and killed the engine, then sat in the cab for a moment, listening to the rain hammer against the roof and watching the lightning flash across the sky. The storm showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it was getting worse, and Wade knew he'd made the right call in pulling off the highway. He'd wait out the weather here, maybe grab a room if they had one available, and continue on in the morning when conditions were safer. Wade pulled on his rain jacket, grabbed his overnight bag and his wallet, and climbed down from the cab. The rain hit him immediately, soaking through his jeans in seconds despite the jacket. The wind was even worse, strong enough that Wade had to lean into it just to stay upright, and the sound was incredible, a roar that drowned out everything else. Wade half ran, half staggered across the parking lot toward the motel office, his boots splashing through puddles that had already formed in the low spots of the gravel. The office door was heavy, solid wood that had warped slightly with age, and Wade had to put his shoulder into it to get it open. He stumbled inside, water dripping from his clothes and hair, and stood there for a moment, catching his breath and trying to wipe the rain out of his eyes. The office was warm, almost too warm, with an electric heater in the corner putting out enough heat to make the small space feel like a sauna. The walls were decorated with faded photographs of the Arizona desert in better times, and there was a desk along the back wall with an old-fashioned guest register and a bell that read "Ring for Service." Behind the desk sat a woman who might have been anywhere from 60 to 80 years old. She had steel gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, sharp features that suggested she'd been beautiful once, and eyes so pale they were almost colorless. She was wearing a cardigan sweater despite the heat, and she was watching Wade with an expression that was difficult to read. Not unfriendly exactly, but not welcoming either. More like she was studying him, trying to decide what kind of person he was and whether she wanted him staying at her motel. "Hell of a storm," Wade said, trying to break the silence. His voice came out rough, and he realized he'd been white-knuckling the steering wheel so hard for the last hour that his throat was tight with tension. The woman nodded slowly. "That it is. We don't get many like this, even out here. You're lucky you found us when you did. Another few miles and you'd have been in real trouble. I appreciate you having the lights on. I've driven this stretch of highway a dozen times, and I don't remember seeing your motel before, but I'm sure glad I saw it tonight." Something flickered across the woman's face, an expression Wade couldn't quite interpret. "We've been here a long time. Since 1952, according to the sign out front, though I think it was here before that under a different name. People miss us sometimes. We're easy to overlook if you're not paying attention." Wade walked up to the desk, his boots squelching with each step and leaving wet footprints on the linoleum floor. "I need a room for the night, just one, and I've got my rig parked out there, if that's okay." "We don't get many truckers," the woman said, but she was already turning the guest register around and sliding it across the desk toward Wade. "Most of them prefer the big truck stops, the ones with showers and restaurants and other drivers to talk to. But you're welcome here. Room's $30 for the night, cash only. No credit cards, no checks." Wade pulled out his wallet and counted out 3 tens, setting them on the desk. The bills looked strange in the warm yellow light of the office, too bright and too modern against the old wood and faded photographs. The woman took the money without counting it and tucked it into a cash box beneath the desk, then pulled out a key attached to a large plastic tag with the number 7 stamped on it. "Room 7 is at the far end," she said, pointing toward the long arm of the L-shaped building. "Clean sheets, clean towels, hot water in the shower. There's no phone in the room and no TV, but I don't imagine you'll be needing either of those tonight. Storm should blow over by morning, and you can be back on your way." Wade took the key, the plastic cold against his palm. "Thank you, ma'am. I didn't catch your name." "Elvira Dunn," the woman said. "I own the place. Have for the last 30 years since my husband passed. If you need anything during the night, anything at all, you just come knock on this door. I live in the apartment in the back, and I'm a light sleeper." "I appreciate that, Mrs. Dunn. I'm Wade Coltrane." "I know," Elvira said, and there was something in the way she said it that made Wade pause. But before he could ask what she meant, she was already turning away, already pulling out a ledger book and making notes in it with a pen that looked like it had been used for decades. Wade stood there for a moment, waiting to see if she would explain, but Elvira seemed to have forgotten he was there. So Wade just nodded, even though she wasn't looking at him, and pushed back out into the storm. The rain was coming down even harder now, and the wind had shifted direction, driving the water horizontally across the parking lot. Wade could barely see room 7 through the downpour, but he managed to navigate his way there, using the numbers on the doors as a guide. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and Wade pushed open the door to room 7. The interior was exactly what he'd expected from a motel that had been built in the 1950s and hadn't been updated much since. A double bed with a faded floral bedspread, a nightstand with a lamp that had a shade decorated with a pattern of desert flowers, a small dresser with a mirror mounted above it, and a door that presumably led to the bathroom. The walls were wood paneling, dark with age, and the carpet was a rust-orange color that had probably been fashionable at some point in the distant past. But it was clean, just like Elvira had promised, and it was dry and warm, which was all Wade really cared about at the moment. He set his overnight bag on the bed, shrugged out of his wet jacket and hung it on a hook by the door, and sat down to pull off his boots. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the desert, thunder rolling and lightning flashing and rain pounding against the window like it was trying to break through the glass. Wade walked over to the window and pulled back the curtain slightly, looking out at the parking lot. His truck was still there, dark and silent in the storm, rain streaming down its sides. And that's when Wade noticed something that made him frown. There was another vehicle in the parking lot now, parked 3 spaces down from his truck. A sedan, dark blue or maybe black. It was hard to tell in the poor light. Wade hadn't seen any other vehicles when he'd pulled in, and he was certain the parking lot had been empty. But there it was, unmistakable. And as Wade watched, he saw the driver's side door open and a figure get out. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a long coat that flapped in the wind. He stood beside his car for a moment, apparently unbothered by the rain, just standing there looking at the motel like he was studying it, or maybe deciding whether to come inside. Then, moving with an odd, deliberate gait, he walked toward the office. Wade watched until the man disappeared from view, blocked by the angle of the building, and then let the curtain fall back into place. Wade told himself there was nothing strange about another person seeking shelter from the storm. This was a motel, after all, a place specifically designed for travelers to stop and rest. But something about the man's movements, about the way he'd just stood there in the rain without seeming to notice it, bothered Wade in a way he couldn't quite articulate. It reminded him of something. Some other time he'd seen someone move like that. But the memory was elusive, sliding away every time Wade tried to focus on it. He was probably just tired, Wade decided. Tired and on edge from fighting the storm and from the general stress of being behind schedule and worrying about delivery times. The man in the parking lot was just another traveler, nothing more, and Wade was letting his imagination run away with him. He needed sleep, needed to get out of his wet clothes and into bed and rest for a few hours before the morning came and he had to get back on the road. Wade went into the bathroom and found that it was exactly as dated as the rest of the room, with pink tile and a pedestal sink and a shower stall that looked like it had been installed sometime during the Eisenhower administration. But the water was hot, just like Elvira had promised, and Wade stood under the spray for a long time, letting the heat soak into his muscles and wash away the tension of the drive. When he finally shut off the water and stepped out, he felt almost human again, almost ready to face whatever tomorrow would bring. He dried off with one of the thin white towels stacked on a shelf above the toilet, then pulled on a clean t-shirt and sweatpants from his overnight bag. The bed looked inviting, the mattress probably not great, but certainly better than trying to sleep in his truck, and Wade was exhausted enough that he probably could have slept on a pile of rocks. He turned off the overhead light, leaving just the lamp on the nightstand burning, and climbed under the covers. That's when he heard the footsteps outside his door. Not hurried, not slow, just steady and deliberate. Someone walking along the covered walkway that ran in front of all the motel rooms. Wade listened as the footsteps approached room 7, slowed as they passed, and then continued on toward the end of the building. He heard a door open and close, the sound muffled by the walls and the rain but still audible. The man from the parking lot, Wade assumed, checking into his own room. Nothing unusual about that. But the footsteps didn't stop. Even after Wade had heard the door close, even after what should have been enough time for the man to be inside his room, Wade could still hear footsteps on the walkway, back and forth, pacing, like someone who couldn't decide whether to go inside or to keep walking. Wade lay in bed listening, trying to convince himself it was just the wind, just the rain, just some acoustic trick of the old building. But the sound was too regular, too rhythmic to be anything but human footsteps. Wade got up and went back to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see out. The walkway was empty. No one was there. No figure pacing back and forth. No man in a long coat. Just rain and darkness, and the occasional flash of lightning that briefly illuminated everything in harsh white light. But Wade could still hear the footsteps. Clearer now, more distinct, and he realized with a chill that they were right outside his door. Someone was standing on the other side of the door to room 7. Wade could hear them breathing, could hear the slight creak of the wooden walkway as weight shifted from one foot to the other. He stood frozen by the window, his hand still holding the curtain, his heart pounding in his chest. The doorknob began to turn, slowly, testing to see if it was locked. Wade had locked it, he was certain he'd locked it, but now he found himself second-guessing that certainty. Had he actually turned the deadbolt? Or had he just closed the door and assumed it would lock automatically? The doorknob stopped turning. Whoever was on the other side had discovered that the door was locked, and for a moment there was complete silence. No breathing, no footsteps, nothing. Then Wade heard something that made his blood run cold. A voice, low and raspy, speaking through the door. "Wade Coltrane, I know you're in there. We need to talk." Wade's mouth went dry. The voice knew his name, just like Elvira had known his name, even though Wade had never met her before tonight, and hadn't told her anything beyond what he'd written in the guest register. How did these people know who he was? What did they want from him? "Who are you?" Wade called out, his voice shakier than he would have liked. "What do you want?" There was a long pause, and then the voice spoke again. "My name is Russell Creed. I'm a traveler, just like you, and I need to talk to you about this place, about the Desert Rose Motel, before it's too late. Before you make the same mistake I did." Wade took a step toward the door, then stopped himself. Every instinct he had was screaming at him not to open that door, not to engage with whoever Russell Creed was or what he wanted. But at the same time, Wade needed answers. He needed to understand what was happening, why people here knew his name, why this motel that he'd never heard of before tonight felt so wrong in ways he couldn't quite define. "Talk to me through the door," Wade said finally. "Tell me what you mean about making a mistake." Another pause. Longer this time. Wade could hear the rain pounding against the roof, could hear the wind howling around the corners of the building, but he couldn't hear Russell Creed breathing anymore. Maybe he'd walked away. Maybe he'd given up and gone back to his own room. But then the voice came again, and this time it was different. Colder, more distant. "You can't stay here, Wade. You need to leave. You need to get in your truck and drive away, right now, storm or no storm. Because if you stay until morning, if you're still here when the sun comes up, you won't be able to leave. None of us can leave. We're all trapped here, Wade. All of us who thought we were just stopping for the night. All of us who thought the Desert Rose was just a normal motel." Wade's hand moved to the deadbolt before he could stop himself, before he could think about what he was doing. He needed to see this person, needed to look Russell Creed in the eye and understand what he was talking about. But just as Wade's fingers touched the metal, just as he was about to turn the lock and open the door, he heard Elvira's voice from somewhere outside. Mr. Creed, you need to go back to your room. You know the rules. No disturbing the other guests, not after dark." "She needs to know," Russell Creed shouted, his voice rising to nearly a scream. "She needs to understand what this place is, what you are." There were sounds of a struggle, footsteps scuffling on the walkway, and then everything went quiet again. Wade stood with his hand still on the deadbolt, his breath coming fast and shallow, trying to decide what to do. He could open the door, could go out there and see what had happened to Russell Creed. Or he could stay inside, could lock himself in room 7 and wait for morning and hope that everything would make sense in the light of day. Wade chose to stay inside. He turned the deadbolt, making sure it was secure, then went back to the bed and sat down on the edge of it. His hands were shaking, and he felt cold despite the warmth of the room. Something was very wrong with the Desert Rose Motel, something that went beyond just an odd atmosphere or strange guests. Russell Creed had said they were all trapped here, that no one could leave once morning came. That was insane, impossible, the kind of thing that only happened in horror movies or bad dreams. But Wade couldn't shake the feeling that Russell Creed had been telling the truth. And now Wade had to decide whether to trust that warning, whether to go back out into the storm and risk his life driving in conditions that could flip his truck, or whether to stay here in this room and find out in the morning what Russell Creed had meant about being trapped. Wade looked at the door, at the deadbolt that seemed suddenly inadequate, and made his decision. He would wait until the storm let up a bit, until he could see well enough to drive safely, and then he would leave. He wouldn't wait for morning. He wouldn't take the chance that Russell Creed's warning was real. He would get out of the Desert Rose Motel while he still could. But for now, he was stuck here, at least for a few more hours, in a room that no longer felt safe, in a motel that shouldn't exist, listening to the storm rage outside and wondering what would happen when morning finally came. Wade sat on the edge of the bed for what felt like hours, listening to the storm and watching the door, half expecting Russell Creed to come back and try the handle again. But the walkway outside remained quiet except for the drumming of rain and the occasional crack of thunder that rattled the windows in their frames. Wade checked his watch repeatedly, watching the minutes crawl by with agonizing slowness. It was just past 11 at night, which meant he had at least 6 or 7 hours until sunrise. 6 or 7 hours to decide whether Russell Creed's warning was real or just the ramblings of someone who'd been on the road too long. Wade tried his cell phone, hoping to call his dispatcher or maybe even the police, anyone who could tell him something about this motel or confirm that it was a legitimate business and not whatever Russell Creed seemed to think it was. But his phone showed no signal, not even a single bar, which wasn't surprising given how remote this area was and how bad the weather had gotten. He was completely cut off from the outside world, alone in this room with nothing but his own thoughts and the growing certainty that something was very wrong with the Desert Rose Motel. Around midnight, Wade decided he couldn't just sit there any longer. He needed to do something, needed to gather information, needed to understand what he was dealing with. If Russell Creed was right, if this place really was some kind of trap, then Wade needed to know what he was up against before he could figure out how to escape. And if Russell Creed was just crazy, if this was all just paranoia and coincidence, then Wade needed to confirm that so he could get some sleep and not waste the rest of the night jumping at shadows. Wade pulled his boots back on, laced them tight, and shrugged into his still damp jacket. He unlocked the deadbolt as quietly as he could and eased open the door, peering out into the storm. The walkway was covered by an overhang that provided some protection from the rain, but the wind was still strong enough to drive water in at an angle, leaving puddles on the concrete. Wade could see 5 or 6 other room doors from where he stood, all of them closed, all of them dark. No lights showing through the windows, no signs of activity. It was as if he and Russell Creed were the only guests at the Desert Rose, which seemed unlikely during a storm this severe. Wade stepped out onto the walkway, pulling the door closed behind him but not locking it. He wanted to be able to get back inside quickly if he needed to. The wind immediately tried to tear the jacket off his back, and Wade had to hold it closed with one hand while using the other to steady himself against the wall. He moved along the walkway toward the office, his boots making soft splashing sounds in the standing water, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The office was still lit, warm yellow light spilling out through the window and onto the parking lot. Wade could see Elvira through the glass, sitting at her desk exactly as she had been when he'd checked in, writing in that ledger book with the same pen. She looked up as Wade approached, her pale eyes tracking his movement, but she didn't smile or wave or show any reaction at all. She just watched him, the way a cat might watch a mouse, patient and predatory and utterly still. Wade knocked on the office door, and after a moment, Elvira rose from her desk and came to open it. She stood in the doorway, blocking his entrance, her expression neutral, but her posture somehow defensive, as if she was prepared to deny him entry if he gave her a reason. "Mr. Coltrane," she said, her voice flat. "Is there a problem with your room?" "No, ma'am, the room's fine. I just wanted to ask you about the other guest. Russell Creed. He came to my door earlier, said some things that worried me." Elvira's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes, a hardness that hadn't been there before. "Mr. Creed has been a guest here for some time. Sometimes he gets confused, says things that don't make sense. You shouldn't pay attention to anything he tells you." "How long has he been a guest here?" Wade asked, trying to keep his tone casual. "Days? Weeks? That's not really your concern, Mr. Coltrane. Mr. Creed's arrangements are between him and the motel. I don't discuss one guest with another. It's a matter of privacy." Wade shifted his weight, trying to see past Elvira into the office, trying to get a look at that ledger book she'd been writing in. "I'm just trying to understand what's going on. He said something about people being trapped here, about not being able to leave after morning comes. That's a pretty serious claim, and I'd like to know if there's any truth to it." Elvira's hand tightened on the doorframe, her knuckles going white. "Mr. Creed is not well. He's been under a lot of stress, and sometimes that stress manifests in paranoid delusions. There's nothing wrong with the Desert Rose Motel. It's a legitimate business that's been serving travelers for over 70 years. You're welcome to stay the night and continue on your way in the morning, or you're welcome to leave right now if you'd prefer, but I won't have you spreading rumors based on the confused ramblings of a disturbed man." There was steel in her voice now, an edge that made it clear the conversation was over. Wade knew he wasn't going to get any more information out of Elvira, at least not directly, so he nodded and stepped back, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "I apologize, Mrs. Dunn. I didn't mean to offend. I'm just tired and on edge from the storm. I'll go back to my room and try to get some sleep." Elvira watched him for a long moment, those pale eyes searching his face, and then she nodded. "That would be wise, Mr. Coltrane. The storm will pass by morning, and everything will seem clearer in the daylight. Things always do." She closed the door, not quite slamming it, but firmly enough to make her point, and Wade was left standing on the walkway alone. He looked at the office window and saw Elvira back at her desk, writing in that ledger again, her head bent over the pages. What was she writing? Guest information, or something else? Wade decided to take a different route back to his room. Instead of retracing his steps along the walkway, he cut across the parking lot using the storm as cover, moving between the few parked vehicles. His truck was still there, untouched, water streaming down its sides. The dark sedan was there too, and as Wade passed it, he tried the door handle, found it locked, and peered through the rain-streaked windows, The interior was empty, except for a road atlas on the passenger seat and what looked like a duffel bag in the back. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would tell him who Russell Creed really was or why he was here. Wade continued around the L-shaped building, counting the room numbers as he went. Room 1, Room 2, Room 3, all dark, all silent. Room 4 had a light on, visible through a gap in the curtains, and Wade moved closer, trying to see inside without being too obvious about it. Through the gap, he could see a man sitting on the edge of a bed, hunched over with his head in his hands. The man was wearing a plaid shirt and jeans, and his hair was dark and unkempt. Russell Creed, Wade assumed, though he couldn't be certain from this angle. Wade was about to move on when the man looked up, and for just a moment their eyes met through the window. Russell Creed's face was gaunt, almost skeletal, with hollow cheeks and dark circles under his eyes that made him look like he hadn't slept in weeks. But it was the expression on his face that made Wade's breath catch in his throat. Pure terror. Absolute, soul-deep fear. The kind of expression you saw on people who'd witnessed something so horrible their minds couldn't process it. Russell Creed mouthed something, his lips moving in an exaggerated way so Wade could read them through the glass. "Get out, now, before she comes back." Before Wade could respond, before he could knock on the window or try to communicate back, the light in room 4 went out, just clicked off, plunging the room into darkness, and Wade could no longer see Russell Creed or anything else inside. He stood there in the rain for a moment, his heart pounding, trying to decide what to do. Should he knock on the door? Try to force his way inside and talk to Russell face to face? Or should he take the man's advice and get the hell out of the Desert Rose while he still could? Wade chose a middle path. He would check the rest of the motel, see if there were any other guests, any other vehicles, anything that would help him understand what was happening here. Then he would make his decision about whether to stay or go. He continued his circuit around the building, past room 5, which was dark, past room 6, which was also dark, until he reached room 7, his own room. The door was still closed, the way he'd left it, but Wade could have sworn he saw movement through the window, a shadow passing in front of the curtains. Wade froze, his hand moving instinctively to his pocket where he kept a folding knife. He always carried it when he was on the road, more as a tool than a weapon, but right now he was glad to have it. Someone was in his room. Either they'd picked the lock or they'd used a master key, but someone had gotten inside while Wade was out investigating, and now they were in there doing God knows what. Wade approached the door slowly, quietly, trying not to make any sound that would alert whoever was inside. He pressed his ear against the wood and listened. There were footsteps inside the room, slow and deliberate, moving from the bed area toward the bathroom. Wade heard the bathroom door open and close, heard water running in the sink, and then silence. Whoever was in there, they were taking their time, not rushing, acting like they had every right to be in Wade's room. Wade unlocked the door as quietly as he could and pushed it open fast, stepping inside with his knife already out and open, ready to defend himself if necessary. The room was empty. The bathroom door was open, the light was off, and there was no sign that anyone had been there. But Wade could smell something, a scent that hadn't been in the room before. Perfume, old-fashioned and heavy, the kind his grandmother used to wear. And there, on the nightstand beside the lamp, was something that definitely hadn't been there when Wade left. A photograph in a tarnished silver frame. Wade picked up the photograph, his hands trembling slightly. It showed a group of people standing in front of the Desert Rose Motel, maybe 15 or 20 of them, all dressed in clothing from what looked like the 1950s or early 1960s. The women wore dresses with full skirts and the men wore suits with thin ties, and they were all smiling at the camera like they were at some kind of celebration. In the center of the group stood a younger version of Elvira Dunn, her hair dark instead of gray, her face unlined and beautiful. She was holding hands with a man who must have been her husband, and they both looked radiantly happy. But it was the other people in the photograph that made Wade's blood run cold. Because standing just behind Elvira, slightly out of focus but still clearly visible, was Russell Creed. He was wearing the same plaid shirt Wade had just seen him in through the window of room 4, and he had the same gaunt, terrified expression on his face. And scattered throughout the group, mixed in among the smiling people in their vintage clothes, were other figures who looked wrong somehow, out of place, their faces slightly blurred like they'd moved while the camera shutter was open. Wade set the photograph back down on the nightstand and took a step back. This didn't make sense. If the photograph was from the 1950s or 1960s, then Russell Creed would have to be in his 70s or 80s by now, not the middle-aged man Wade had seen through the window. Unless the photograph wasn't as old as it looked, unless it had been staged, dressed up to look vintage. But why would anyone do that? What possible reason could there be? Wade heard footsteps outside again, multiple sets this time, moving along the walkway in formation like soldiers marching. He went to the window and looked out, and what he saw made him question his own sanity. There were people on the walkway, at least a dozen of them, all dressed in clothing from different eras. Some wore styles from the 1950s, others from the 1970s or 1980s, and a few wore modern clothes like jeans and t-shirts. They were walking in a line, one behind the other, their movements synchronized and mechanical, like puppets being controlled by the same strings. At the front of the line was Elvira Dunn, and she was no longer wearing the cardigan sweater she'd had on in the office. Now she was dressed in a white gown that looked like something from a much earlier era, maybe the 1920s or 1930s, long and flowing and decorated with intricate embroidery. Her hair was down, hanging loose around her shoulders, and in the light from the storm Wade could see that it wasn't gray anymore. It was dark, jet black, and it moved in the wind like it was alive. The line of people walked past Wade's window, none of them looking in his direction, all of them staring straight ahead with blank, emotionless faces. Wade recognized Russell Creed among them, walking near the end of the line, his lips still moving in that same desperate plea. "Get out! Get out! Get out!" Wade backed away from the window, his mind racing. This wasn't natural. This wasn't normal. Whatever the Desert Rose Motel was, it wasn't just a roadside motel. It was something else, something wrong, something that existed outside the normal rules of reality. And Wade was trapped here until the storm passed, trapped with Elvira and Russell Creed and all these other people who shouldn't exist, who couldn't exist. He needed to leave. Right now. Storm or no storm, visibility or no visibility, Wade needed to get in his truck and drive away from this place as fast as he could. He grabbed his overnight bag, threw his few belongings into it, and moved toward the door. But before he could open it, before he could step out onto the walkway, he heard Elvira's voice. Not from outside, but from inside the room, speaking directly into his ear, even though he could see she wasn't there. "You can't leave yet, Mr. Coltrane. The storm hasn't passed. You're not ready to leave. None of them were ready when they tried to leave. That's why they're still here. That's why they'll always be here." Wade spun around, looking for the source of the voice, but the room was empty. Just him and the bed and the photograph on the nightstand. He grabbed the photograph and looked at it again, and this time he noticed something he'd missed before. In the background of the image, parked in what looked like the exact same spot where Wade had parked his truck, was an 18-wheeler. It was an old-style rig, the kind that hadn't been manufactured since the 1970s, but it was unmistakably a commercial truck. And standing beside it, visible through the truck's windshield, was a man who looked exactly like Wade. No, not exactly like Wade, but similar enough to be his father, or his grandfather. Someone from his family, someone who'd been a trucker, someone who'd stopped at the Desert Rose Motel on Highway 666 and never left. Wade's hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped the photograph. He set it down carefully on the nightstand and backed toward the door, his breath coming in short gasps. This was impossible. This was insane. But it was happening, it was real, and Wade needed to accept that if he was going to have any chance of surviving. The door burst open before Wade could reach it, and Russell Creed stumbled inside, his clothes soaked through with rain, his eyes wild. He grabbed Wade by the shoulders, his fingers digging in painfully, and pulled him close. "You have to listen to me," Russell gasped. "I know you think I'm crazy, I know I sound insane, but I've been here for 3 years. 3 years, Wade. I stopped one night during a storm, just like you did, and I've been trying to leave ever since. Every morning, I get in my car, I start the engine, I drive toward the highway, and every time I end up back here. The road just loops around, no matter which direction I go, and I always end up back at the Desert Rose." Wade tried to pull away, but Russell's grip was iron. "That's impossible. Roads don't work like that. There has to be a way out." "There is a way out," Russell said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But you have to leave before sunrise. Once the sun comes up, once morning breaks, the spell or curse or whatever the hell this is becomes permanent. You become part of the motel, part of Elvira's collection. All these people you saw walking on the walkway, they all made the same mistake. They all stayed until morning, and now they can't leave. They're bound here, trapped, walking the same paths over and over for eternity." "How do you know this?" Wade demanded. "How do you know any of this is true?" "Because I've watched it happen." Russell released Wade and stumbled backward, his hands going to his head. "I've watched new guests arrive, watched them check in, watched them stay the night. And in the morning, they're different. They're hollow. They join the procession, walking with Elvira and the others, and they never leave. But I haven't stayed until morning yet. I've always managed to stay awake, always managed to fight the pull. That's why I can still talk to you, still warn you, because I haven't given in yet." Wade looked at Russell, at the exhaustion in his eyes, at the way his whole body was shaking. The man was clearly at the end of his rope, barely holding on, and Wade realized that Russell was telling the truth. He really had been here for 3 years, really had been fighting to stay awake night after night, resisting whatever force was trying to claim him. "What about you?" Wade asked. "Why don't you leave now, with me? We'll both get out of here." Russell laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "I told you, I've tried. Every day I try. But I can't do it alone. I need someone else, someone new, someone who isn't bound yet. You have to leave, Wade. You have to get in your truck and drive away, and you have to do it before sunrise. Don't look back. Don't stop. Just drive until you're miles away from here, and maybe, just maybe, you'll break free. What happens to you if I leave?" Russell's expression crumbled. "I don't know. Maybe I become like them? Maybe I join the procession, or maybe I just fade away, cease to exist. But either way, it's better than this. Better than being trapped in this endless loop, watching people arrive and never leave, knowing that eventually I'll give in and join them." Wade wanted to argue, wanted to say he wouldn't leave Russell behind, but he knew there wasn't time. The storm was still raging outside, but it would pass eventually, and when it did, morning would come. Wade had maybe 4 or 5 hours at most. He needed to go now, while he still could. "I'm sorry," Wade said. and he meant it. "I'm sorry I can't help you." "You can help me," Russell said quietly. "You can leave. You can prove that it's possible. That's all I need to know, that someone made it out." Wade grabbed his overnight bag, took one last look at the photograph on the nightstand, and headed for the door. Russell didn't try to stop him, didn't say anything else, just stood in the middle of the room with his shoulders slumped and his eyes closed, looking like a man who'd already given up. Wade wanted to say something, wanted to offer some words of comfort or hope, but there was nothing to say. So he just left, stepping out onto the walkway and into the storm. The wind hit him immediately, stronger than before, nearly knocking him off his feet. Wade leaned into it and pushed forward, moving toward the parking lot where his truck waited. The line of people was still there, still walking in their synchronized procession, and as Wade passed them he could see their faces more clearly. They were all blank, expressionless, like mannequins that had been given the ability to walk, but not to think or feel. And at the front of the line, leading them, was Elvira. She turned her head as Wade passed, those pale eyes locking onto his, and she smiled. "You won't make it, Mr. Coltrane," she called out, her voice somehow audible over the storm. "The road won't let you go. It never does. You'll drive and drive and drive, and you'll end up right back here. They all do. In the end, everyone comes home to the desert rose." Wade didn't respond. He just ran, splashing through puddles, his boots slipping on the wet gravel, until he reached his truck. He threw his overnight bag into the cab, climbed in after it, and slammed the door shut. His hands were shaking so badly it took him 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. But finally the engine roared to life, the sound loud and powerful and reassuringly normal. Wade put the truck in gear and pulled out of the parking lot, his headlights cutting through the rain and illuminating the highway ahead. He didn't look in his mirrors, didn't look back at the Desert Rose Motel, just focused on the road and on getting as far away as possible. The storm was still heavy, visibility was terrible, but Wade didn't care. He'd rather risk flipping the truck in the wind than stay another minute at that cursed place. He drove for what felt like hours, the white lines of the highway disappearing and reappearing in the rain, the desert a black void on either side of him. Wade watched the mile markers, counting them off, trying to calculate how far he'd come from the motel. 10 miles, 20 miles, 30 miles. He should be far enough away by now. He should be safe. But then he saw it. Up ahead, glowing through the rain, a neon sign spelling out Desert Rose in faded pink letters. And beneath it, flickering between vacancy and no vacancy, that smaller sign that Wade had sworn he'd left behind. Russell Creed had been right. The road looped back. No matter how far Wade drove, no matter which direction he went, he always ended up back at the Desert Rose Motel. Wade slammed on his brakes, the truck skidding slightly on the wet pavement, and sat there staring at that sign in disbelief. This wasn't possible. He'd been driving in a straight line, had watched the mile markers increasing, had seen the road stretching out before him. There was no way he could be back at the motel. No way at all. But there it was. And standing in the parking lot waiting for him was Elvira Dunn. Wade sat in his idling truck, staring at Elvira through the rain-streaked windshield, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were telling him. He'd driven for at least 40 minutes in a straight line, had watched the mile markers click past, had felt every bump and curve of the highway beneath his tires. There was no physical way he could be back at the Desert Rose Motel. The laws of physics, of geography, of basic reality itself wouldn't allow it. But here he was, and there she stood, waiting for him like she'd known all along that he would return. Elvira raised one hand in a slow wave, a gesture that might have been friendly if not for the expression on her face. She was smiling, but it was the kind of smile that belonged on a predator, all teeth and cold satisfaction. Wade's first instinct was to throw the truck into reverse, to back away from the motel and try a different direction, any direction that wasn't forward. But even as the thought formed, he knew it was pointless. Russell Creed had tried every direction, had tried every possible combination of turns and routes, and he'd always ended up back here. The Desert Rose wasn't just a motel. It was a trap, and the trap had closed around Wade the moment he'd pulled into the parking lot. Wade killed the engine and climbed down from the cab. There was no point in wasting fuel, no point in pretending he had anywhere else to go. The rain was still coming down hard, and lightning split the sky overhead, illuminating Elvira's white gown so that for a moment she looked like a ghost, ethereal and otherworldly. Wade walked toward her slowly, his boots squelching in the mud that had formed where gravel should have been, and stopped about 10 feet away. "How?" Wade asked, his voice barely audible over the storm. "How does the road loop back? How is this possible?" Elvira tilted her head, studying him with those pale, colorless eyes. "Does it matter? You're here. You'll always be here. Fighting it only makes things harder, Mr. Coltrane. Acceptance is so much easier." "I don't accept this," Wade said, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "I don't accept any of this. I'm a trucker. I drive trucks. I deliver loads and I go home and I see my family. That's my life. That's reality. Not this. Not whatever twisted nightmare you've created here." "Created?" Elvira laughed, a sound like wind chimes made of bone. "I didn't create anything, Mr. Coltrane. The Desert Rose has always been here, long before I arrived, long before my husband bought this property in 1952 and thought he could make something of it. This place, this stretch of Highway 6666, it exists in the spaces between. It's a crossroads, a junction point where different roads and different times all converge. And once you stop here, once you accept its hospitality, you become part of it, part of the pattern." Wade took a step back, his mind racing. Different times converging. That would explain the photograph, explain why Russell Creed could be in an image from the 1950s and still be here now, barely aged. It would explain the procession of people in clothes from different eras, all of them trapped in the same endless loop. But understanding it didn't help Wade escape it. "Russell Creed said I have until sunrise," Wade said. "He said if I can get away before morning, I won't be bound here. Is that true?" Elvira's smile widened. "Mr. Creed has been here longer than most. He's learned some of the rules, figured out some of the patterns. Yes, sunrise is significant. Once dawn breaks over the Desert Rose, once you've spent a full night under its roof, the binding becomes permanent. You become part of the motel, part of me, part of everything that waits here in the between spaces. But you've already tried to leave, Mr. Coltrane. You've already discovered that the road won't let you go. So what makes you think you can escape before sunrise?" Wade didn't have an answer for that. He'd tried driving away and ended up right back here. If the road itself was part of the trap, if every direction led back to the Desert Rose, then what options did he have? He could try going off-road, driving across the open desert, but his truck wasn't equipped for that kind of terrain, and he'd probably just get stuck or damage his rig. He could try walking, but on foot in a storm like this, he wouldn't make it more than a few miles before exhaustion or exposure got him. Every option seemed designed to fail, designed to keep him here until morning came and the trap closed permanently. "There has to be a way," Wade said, more to himself than to Elvira. "There has to be something I can do." "There is," Elvira said softly. "You can stop fighting. You can come inside, go back to your room, and rest. When morning comes, you'll join the others, and you'll finally understand what the Desert Rose really is. You'll understand why people stay here, why they walk the paths I set for them, why they serve the motel. It's not a curse, Mr. Coltrane. It's a purpose. It's belonging to something larger than yourself. It's prison, Wade said. You're keeping people prisoner here against their will. Am I? Elvira spread her arms, gesturing at the motel, at the storm, at everything around them. Look at them, Mr. Coltrane. Look at the guests who walk these paths. Do they look unhappy to you? Do they look like they're suffering? Wade thought about the blank faces he'd seen, the expressionless procession moving in mechanical synchronization. They hadn't looked unhappy, but they hadn't looked happy either. They'd looked empty, hollow, like someone had scooped out everything that made them human and left only the shell behind. That wasn't peace, that wasn't contentment, that was erasure. Where's Russell? Wade asked, changing tactics. What happened to him after I left my room? Mr. Creed is resting, Elvira said. He's been fighting for so long, resisting for so long. Tonight, I think he'll finally give in. Tonight, I think he'll finally accept his place here. I want to see him. Why? So he can fill your head with more desperate schemes? So he can convince you there's still hope when there isn't. Mr. Creed has been here for 3 years, and in all that time he hasn't managed to leave. What makes you think you'll succeed where he's failed? Because I have to, Wade said simply. Because I have a life out there. People who depend on me. Places I need to be. I can't just disappear. I won't. Elvira studied him for a long moment, and something shifted in her expression. For just a second, Wade thought he saw something human there, some flicker of the woman she must have been before whatever had happened to her in this place. But then it was gone, replaced by that cold, predatory smile. Very well, Elvira said. You want to see Mr. Creed? Room 4. But I warn you, Mr. Coltrane, he's not the man you spoke to earlier. The night has been hard on him, very hard indeed. Wade didn't wait for further permission. He turned and walked toward Room 4, his boots splashing through puddles, the rain soaking through his jacket and chilling him to the bone. He could feel Elvira watching him, could feel her eyes on his back like a physical weight, but he didn't look back. He just kept walking until he reached Room 4 and pounded on the door. Russell Creed, open up, it's Wade. There was no answer. Wade tried the door handle and found it unlocked. He pushed it open and stepped inside, and what he saw made his stomach turn. The room was identical to his own. Same furniture, same layout, same faded floral bedspread. But covering every surface, written in what looked like marker, or maybe blood, were words. Hundreds of them, thousands maybe, covering the walls and the dresser and even the ceiling. The same phrases repeated over and over in increasingly frantic handwriting. Can't leave, can't escape, road loops back, sunrise coming, don't fall asleep, don't give in, can't leave, can't escape, and in the middle of it all, curled up on the bed in a fetal position, was Russell Creed. His eyes were open but unfocused, staring at nothing, and his lips were still moving in that same desperate mantra Wade had seen through the window. But now there was no sound, just the silent movement of his mouth forming words that had lost all meaning through endless repetition. Wade knelt beside the bed, putting his hand on Russell's shoulder. Hey, Russell, can you hear me? It's Wade. I came back. I tried to leave, but the road brought me back, just like you said it would. Russell's eyes shifted slightly, focusing on Wade's face, and for a moment there was recognition there. His hand shot out and grabbed Wade's wrist with surprising strength, pulling him closer. 3 years, Russell whispered, his voice barely audible. 3 years I've been writing on these walls. 3 years I've been trying to map it, trying to understand the pattern, and I finally figured it out, Wade. I finally understand how the trap works. Tell me, Wade urged. Tell me how to break it. Russell's grip tightened painfully. You can't break it, not from inside. The desert rose exists in a pocket, a fold in space and time. Every road that leads away from here just curves back into itself, like a Mobius strip. You drive forward, but you're actually driving in a circle so tight you can't perceive the curve. That's why you end up back here. That's why everyone ends up back here. Then how do I get out? There has to be a way. You said sunrise was the key, that I could escape before dawn. That's what I thought, Russell said, his eyes filling with tears. That's what I believed for 3 years. But I was wrong, Wade. I was wrong about all of it. There is no escape. There is no way out. The only way to leave the desert rose is to become part of it, to let it absorb you, to join the procession and walk Elvira's paths until you forget you were ever anything else. Wade felt something break inside him, some last vestige of hope crumbling into dust. No, I don't accept that. There has to be something, some way to fight back. Russell released Wade's wrist and rolled over, turning his back to him. Fight then. Fight all you want. I'm done fighting. When the sun comes up, I'm going to walk outside and join the others. At least then the struggling will stop. At least then I'll have peace. Wade stood up, backing away from the bed, his mind reeling. Russell had given up. After 3 years of resistance, 3 years of trying to find a way out, he'd finally surrendered. And if Russell, who'd had 3 years to study the problem, couldn't find a solution, what chance did Wade have? Wade left room 4 and stood on the walkway, the rain pouring down around him, the thunder rolling across the desert like artillery fire. He checked his watch. It was almost 3 in the morning, which meant he had maybe 3 hours until sunrise. 3 hours to find a way out of a trap that had held Russell Creed for 3 years and had held God knows how many other travelers before him. Wade walked back toward his truck, his mind working furiously. Russell had said the desert rose existed in a pocket, a fold in space and time. That meant it wasn't part of the normal world, wasn't subject to normal physical laws. The road looped back because the space itself was bent, curved in on itself like a trap. But if that was true, if the desert rose existed outside normal reality, then maybe the rules that governed it were different too. Maybe there were ways to manipulate the space, to find weaknesses in the fold. Wade climbed into his truck and sat in the driver's seat, thinking. He was a trucker, not a physicist, but he'd been driving long enough to understand roads, to understand how traffic patterns worked, how routes connected to each other. And if the desert rose was a junction point, a place where different roads and different times converged, then maybe there were multiple entry points, multiple ways in. And if there were multiple ways in, logic suggested there should be multiple ways out. Wade started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, heading back toward the highway. But this time, he didn't just drive straight. This time he paid attention to every detail of the road, every mile marker, every slight variation in the pavement. And that's when he noticed something he'd missed before. The mile markers weren't increasing in a normal sequence. They went 247, 248, 249, and then jumped to 246, then back to 248, then to 250. The numbers were out of order, shuffled and mixed, like someone had taken a deck of cards and scattered them randomly. Wade realized what this meant. The road wasn't just looping back in space. It was looping back in time as well, folding different moments into each other so that past and present and future all existed simultaneously. That's why the photograph showed people from different eras. That's why Russell Creed could be in an image from the 1950s. The desert rose existed at all times at once, a fixed point where time had become tangled and knotted like a ball of string. But if time was tangled here, if different moments were overlapping, then maybe Wade could use that. Maybe he could find a moment when the trap hadn't closed yet. A version of the road that led somewhere other than back to the desert rose. He just needed to figure out how to navigate between the moments, how to jump from one timeline to another. Wade drove slowly, watching the mile markers change in their nonsensical sequence, trying to find a pattern. 247, 248, 246, 249, 247, 250, 248. There had to be logic to it. Some underlying structure that would tell him which markers corresponded to which moments in time. And then he saw it. The markers that decreased were older, represented earlier times, while the markers that increased were newer. And if he could string together a sequence that only increased, that only moved forward in time, he might be able to break out of the loop. Wade started making mental notes. When the marker changed from 248 to 249, he took note of exactly how fast he was going, exactly what the road looked like, exactly where the lightning was flashing in the sky. When it jumped to 250, he did the same. And slowly, painfully, he began to piece together the pattern. The road that led forward in time appeared when his speed was above 45 miles per hour, when the rain was heaviest, when the lightning was most frequent. It was the road that existed during the storm, during the chaos, during the moment when reality was most unstable. Wade pressed down on the accelerator, pushing his speed up past 50, past 60, watching the mile markers flash by. 249, 250, 251, 252. They were increasing now, moving forward. And Wade felt a surge of hope. He was doing it. He was following the path that led out of the temporal loop, the version of Highway 606 that existed in a single coherent timeline. But then he saw the lights behind him. 2 headlights, bright and steady, gaining on him fast. Wade looked in his side mirror and his blood ran cold. It was the procession. All of them, dozens of vehicles from different eras, all driving in formation, all chasing him. At the front was a 1950s sedan, and behind it a 1970s pickup truck, and behind that a modern SUV. And leading them all, visible through the rain-streaked windshield of the sedan, was Elvira Dunn. The vehicles were matching his speed effortlessly, staying right on his bumper no matter how fast he went. Wade pushed the accelerator to the floor, his truck roaring as it reached 70 miles per hour. Far too fast for these conditions. But he didn't care. He just needed to stay ahead. Needed to keep following the forward-moving mile markers until he broke free of the Desert Rose's influence. His CB radio crackled to life, even though Wade hadn't turned it on. Elvira's voice came through, distorted by static but still clear enough to understand. "You can't outrun us, Mr. Coltrane. We're part of the road itself. We exist in all times simultaneously. There is no version of Highway 606 that doesn't include the Desert Rose. There is no escape." Wade grabbed the CB mic and keyed it, his voice coming out as a roar. "Watch me!" The mile markers were still increasing. 253, 254, 255. Wade was getting farther from the motel with each passing second, and the vehicles behind him weren't getting any closer. Maybe Elvira was wrong. Maybe there was a version of the road that existed beyond her reach. Maybe if Wade could just keep going fast enough, far enough, he could break free. The storm was reaching its peak now, the wind so strong it was pushing Wade's truck toward the shoulder. The rain so heavy his wipers couldn't keep up. Lightning struck somewhere close by, so close Wade could smell the ozone, and for just a moment the entire desert was illuminated in stark white light. And in that light, Wade saw something ahead that made his heart sink. The road ended. just stopped, like someone had cut it off with a knife. Beyond the pavement there was nothing, just empty space, a void that seemed to swallow light and sound and everything else. Wade was driving toward the edge of reality itself, toward a place where the road simply ceased to exist. And if he went over that edge, if he drove into that void, he didn't know what would happen. Maybe he'd die. Maybe he'd fall forever. Or maybe he'd end up right back at the Desert Rose, having accomplished nothing but proving Elvira right. Wade slammed on his brakes, his truck skidding on the wet pavement, tires screaming in protest. The rig fishtailed wildly, the trailer swinging out to the side, and for a horrible moment Wade thought he was going to jackknife or flip or go over the edge despite his efforts. But somehow, through a combination of skill and desperate luck, he managed to bring the truck to a stop about 20 feet from where the road ended. Wade sat there gasping for breath, his hands locked on the steering wheel, staring at that impossible edge. He'd been so focused on moving forward, on following the increasing mile markers, that he hadn't considered where the road might lead. And now he was trapped between the void ahead and the procession behind, with nowhere left to go. The vehicles pulled up behind him and stopped, forming a semicircle that blocked any retreat. Doors opened and figures stepped out, all of them moving in that same synchronized mechanical way. They walked toward Wade's truck slowly, inevitably, and Wade knew that this was it. This was the end. He'd tried to escape, had come closer than Russell Creed ever had, but ultimately the trap was too perfect, too complete. There was no way out of the Desert Rose Motel. Elvira walked up to the driver's side door and looked up at Wade through the window. Her expression was triumphant but also sad, like a parent disappointed in a child who'd misbehaved. "You tried, Mr. Coltrane, I'll give you that. You tried harder than most. But now you've seen what lies beyond the roads, what exists at the edges of the fold. There is no escape. There is only acceptance. Come down from your truck. Come join us. Let me show you what peace really means." Wade looked at the edge of the road, at that void that seemed to call to him with a voice he could feel in his bones. He thought about Russell Creed, about how he'd given up after 3 years of fighting, about how he was going to join the procession when morning came. Wade thought about his own family, about the life he'd left behind, about everything he'd lose if he stepped down from this truck and let Elvira claim him. And then Wade had an idea, a desperate, insane idea that probably wouldn't work, but was the only option he had left. If the Desert Rose existed in a fold in space and time, if it was a pocket dimension held together by some kind of binding force, then what would happen if Wade disrupted that binding? What would happen if he damaged the structure of the fold itself? The void at the edge of the road wasn't nothing. It was the boundary where the Desert Rose's influence ended, where the pocket dimension gave way to normal reality. And if Wade could somehow bridge that gap, if he could force a connection between the folded space and the normal world beyond, he might be able to break the loop entirely. Wade looked at his truck, at the 80,000 pounds of steel and cargo he was hauling. It was a weapon, if he chose to use it that way, a battering ram that could smash through almost anything if he built up enough speed and momentum. And if he aimed it at that edge, if he drove straight toward that void at full speed, the impact might be enough to tear open the fold, to create a rupture that would allow him to escape. Of course, it might also kill him. Probably would kill him. But Wade was out of options, and dying in a crash seemed preferable to spending eternity as one of Elvira's hollow puppets, walking the same paths forever in mindless obedience. Wade started the engine, which had died when he'd hit the brakes. Elvira heard it and her expression changed, understanding dawning in those pale eyes. "Don't," she said, her voice sharp with alarm. "Don't do what you're thinking. You'll destroy everything. You'll collapse the fold and everyone inside it will be lost. All the travelers who found refuge here, all the people who've been given purpose, They'll all cease to exist. Good, Wade said, and threw the truck into reverse. He backed up as far as he could, giving himself maximum distance for acceleration, then shifted into drive and pressed the accelerator to the floor. The truck surged forward, building speed rapidly, and the figures scattered to get out of his way. Elvira was screaming something, her voice lost in the roar of the engine and the howl of the storm. But Wade wasn't listening anymore. He was focused entirely on that edge, on that void, on the moment of impact that would either kill him or set him free. The truck hit the edge doing 70 miles per hour, and everything exploded. There was a sound like reality itself tearing, a flash of light so bright it burned even through Wade's closed eyelids, and a sensation of falling, tumbling, spinning through space and time. Wade felt the truck come apart around him, felt the cab separate from the trailer, felt himself being thrown forward, even though his seatbelt was locked tight. He felt impact after impact, metal crumpling and glass shattering, and through it all he could hear Elvira screaming, her voice echoing across dimensions. And then silence. Complete, absolute silence. Wade opened his eyes and found himself lying on his back on hard pavement, staring up at a sky that was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. The storm was gone. The desert rose was gone. The void was gone. He was lying on Highway 666, the normal Highway 666, with nothing around him but empty desert and the scattered wreckage of his truck. Wade sat up slowly, checking himself for injuries. His body ached everywhere, and he was pretty sure he had a few cracked ribs, but he was alive. He'd survived the crash, survived the collapse of the fold, survived the Desert Rose Motel. He looked around for any sign of Elvira, or the procession, or any indication that the temporal loop had followed him back to normal reality. But there was nothing. Just him and the dawn and the open road. Wade climbed to his feet and started walking. His truck was totaled, his cargo scattered across a quarter-mile of highway, but he was free. He'd escaped. He'd done what Russell Creed couldn't do, what hundreds of other travelers probably couldn't do. He'd broken the trap and survived. As the sun rose over the desert, Wade walked north along Highway 666, following the mile markers that now increased in proper sequence. He walked for 2 hours before a highway patrol officer spotted him and pulled over, offering him a ride to the nearest town. Wade accepted gratefully, climbing into the warm police cruiser and trying to figure out how to explain what had happened without sounding insane. "You okay, buddy?" the officer asked, studying Wade's bruised and battered appearance. "Looks like you've had a rough night." "You could say that," Wade replied. "My truck went off the road during the storm. I crashed trying to avoid something on the highway." "What were you trying to avoid?" Wade thought about Elvira, about Russell Creed, about the Desert Rose Motel and everything he'd seen there. He thought about the procession of hollow-eyed travelers and the fold in space and time and the void at the edge of reality. But he knew no one would believe any of that. Knew he'd sound like he was suffering from head trauma or shock if he tried to explain. "A deer," Wade said finally. "I swerved to avoid a deer." The officer nodded, apparently satisfied with this explanation, and drove Wade to a truck stop in Holbrook, where he could call his company and arrange for someone to come pick him up. While he waited, Wade bought coffee and sat in a booth by the window, watching other truckers come and go, living their normal lives on normal roads with normal destinations. Wade knew he'd never drive Highway 666 again. He'd find different routes, take longer paths, do whatever it took to avoid that stretch of road between Holbrook and the Arizona border. Because even though he'd escaped the Desert Rose, even though he'd collapsed the fold and freed himself from the loop, Wade couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, in some pocket dimension that still existed in the spaces between, Elvira Dunn was waiting. Waiting for him to make a mistake, to let his guard down, to stop at the wrong place at the wrong time and give her another chance to claim him. And Wade thought about Russell Creed, about whether he'd been freed when the fold collapsed or if he'd been erased along with the Desert Rose. Wade hoped it was the former. Hoped that Russell was out there somewhere living a normal life and finally getting the rest he'd been denied for 3 years. But Wade suspected it was the latter. Suspected that Russell and all the other trapped travelers had ceased to exist when Wade destroyed their prison. Wade would have to live with that guilt. Would have to accept that his freedom had come at the cost of everyone else's existence. It was a price he hadn't wanted to pay, but it had been the only way out. And in the end, Wade had chosen his own survival over theirs. Had chosen to collapse the fold and risk destroying everyone inside it rather than join them in eternal captivity. As Wade sat in that truck stop booth, drinking his coffee and watching the sunrise paint the desert in shades of gold and orange, he wondered if he'd made the right choice. He wondered if Russell would have wanted Wade to save him that way, by erasing him from existence. He wondered if the other travelers, the ones in the procession with their blank faces and hollow eyes, had been better off trapped in the Desert Rose than they would have been scattered across time and space when the fold collapsed. But Wade would never know the answers to those questions. All he knew was that he'd survived, that he'd escaped, and that every night for the rest of his life he'd dream about a motel that shouldn't exist, and a woman in a white gown who smiled with too many teeth. Highway 606 still exists, still cuts through the Arizona desert, still carries truckers and travelers from one place to another. But sometimes, late at night when the storms roll in, drivers report seeing lights in the distance that don't correspond to any town or truck stop on the maps. They report seeing a neon sign that spells out Desert Rose, flickering between vacancy and no vacancy. And some of them, exhausted and desperate for shelter, pull off the highway and follow those lights. They're never seen again. Wade Coltrane knows this because he tracks the reports, monitors the forums where truckers share their stories, watches for any mention of the Desert Rose. He knows that collapsing the fold didn't destroy Elvira's trap, didn't free the travelers who were caught there. It just moved it, shifted it to a different location or a different time, and now it's out there waiting for new guests. And sometimes, when Wade is driving at night and the weather turns bad, he sees those lights too. He sees that neon sign beckoning to him, promising shelter and rest, and an end to the endless miles. But Wade never stops. He just drives past, his hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Because Wade Coltrane learned the hard way that some places don't want to let you leave. Some places exist in the spaces between reality and nightmare, waiting for travelers who are lost or desperate or just unlucky enough to stop at the wrong place at the wrong time. And the Desert Rose Motel is still out there, somewhere on Highway 606, waiting for its next guest.